Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1973 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Glenda Jackson won for her performance in A Touch of Class. But why did she beat fellow nominees Ellen Burstyn, Marsha Mason, Barbra Streisand, and Joanne Woodward? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 46th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1973. We'll be discussing how Glenda Jackson won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today is always such a joy to have on the show. I've had him on time and time again, including on the very first episode of this Best Actress series, where we broke down Janet Gaynor, Gloria Swanson, and the iconic Louise Dresser. One of the biggest Oscar obsessives I know. His writings can be found at Awards Watch and his own blog, The Awards Connection. Welcome back to the show, Andrew Carden.
Kevin, how's it going?
It is going well. We're in the 70s now. Could you believe it?
I know you've come a long way since Louise Dresser.
Yes, it's true. But she will always be in our hearts.
Yes, the icon, the moments, the mystery, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Well, I did also just want to congratulate you as well on, I hear you have a script in development in the works. I don't know if you want to mention anything about that.
Yeah, so during the pandemic, when I was still working from home, I'm not anymore, unfortunately, I kind of on the side started writing screenplays, and I ended up writing 4 screenplays. And ever since then, I have been, pitching them to producers and reaching out to folks. And about a month back, I connected with a producer who expressed interest in one of them. And ultimately, it's been optioned. So, we'll see what happens. The next 2 years, this could potentially go further and be sold, and hopefully, fingers crossed, actually become something. But
Yeah.
it's super exciting, and it's just kind of surreal, honestly. So
Yeah, it's
we'll
incredible.
see.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very proud of you. And it is in the horror genre, I believe.
It is. It's called Dead Mall, and
Mm-hmm.
the basic premise is that a group of teenagers decide to spend the night in an abandoned mall in their neighborhood, not realizing that a group of serial killers who just escaped from the sanitarium have been hiding out there.
Wow.
And a lot of mayhem ensues.
Hijinks ensue. Yes.
Yes, many hijinks.
That sounds very juicy.
It
Hopefully
also
that,
has
yeah.
a juicy supporting role that I could see several of the actresses we're about to discuss
Oh,
in. It's
wow.
the veteran psychiatrist who has known them all their lives and has to step in to kind of save the day. So
Wow. Yeah, that's that. I mean, if you get one of these ladies, then I will be
I would
in
I would
awe.
die.
Yes. Wow. Well, the reason I also wanted to bring that up is because we are talking about a horror performance today, so very fitting, I think, to have you on for this episode. But before we talk 1973, let's talk about Best Actress as a category. And as a returning guest, you've already told me your favorite Best Actress win of all time is Shirley Booth. So my alternate question for you here as a returning guest is, what would you say is your favorite Best Actress lineup of all time?
So for me, it's actually a lineup just a few years down the road from this one, and it's the 1978 lineup,
Yes.
which is Geraldine Page in Interiors, Ingrid Bergman in Autumn Sonata, Ellen Burstyn in Same Time Next Year, Jill Clayburgh in An Unmarried Woman, and the winner was Jane Fonda in Coming Home. For me, I mean, these are, of course, five of the all-time great actresses. For me, three of these performances are their all-time greatest. I think that Interiors, Autumn Sonata, and Unmarried Woman are the career best turns by these actresses. They're all so phenomenal, and they may honestly be among my top 10, certainly my top 20 all-time favorite Best Actress nominees. They're just extraordinary. And I think that Jane Fonda is wonderful in Coming Home. I think that a lot of people consider her turn in Kloop to be superior. For me, it's a pretty close call, but I think that she's pretty fantastic in Coming Home. And then the fifth nominee is Ellen Burstyn, who is in a film that isn't really the greatest, but I still think she's doing very good work in it. So there's really not a bad contender in the bunch. And again, three of them are just absolutely mind-blowing. So for me, that's, the number one. And I think it's going to make for an incredible episode, a few
Yes.
episodes from now.
I am itching to get to that year. That's one of those years that, like a 1950 kind of like highly anticipated, I think.
It's also a lineup where I've constantly changed my winner. I
Yeah.
think initially I was probably leaning toward Clayburgh, and then eventually Bergman, and then I now kind of lean more toward Geraldine Page, even if she's kind of a questionable lead.
Right.
But you can make an amazing case for any of those, and I think it's not unlike the category we're about to discuss, where I find myself really kind of struggling among two or three of the contenders.
Yeah.
I know, my winner has changed in '73 several times over the years. So we'll see who I ultimately land on this time.
Wow. Yeah.
But
I don't think I
very
even know
competitive.
where you land on this year, so it could
So
be any of them.
yeah, I looked back when you were doing the rankings on all of these Best Actress lineups, all the
Uh-huh.
acting lineups, and my ranking from a few years ago has changed
Ooh,
from what it is today. So
interesting. All right.
yeah.
Excited to break that down. Well, my other question, of course, you told me on that first episode that the joint loss of Glenn Close and Sigourney Weaver in '88 was your most heartbreaking loss. But I'm curious here, what would you say is your most heartbreaking snub in Best Actress? Someone who didn't even get the nomination.
So I, of course, had a long list, and I managed to kind of narrow it down to a top five.
Mm-hmm.
The four contenders who aren't number one are Kathy Bates and Dolores Claiborne. I think that's her best performance.
Mm-hmm.
Pam Grier and Jackie Brown,
Oh
just
yeah.
inexplicable snub. Obviously, should have made the cut in '97. Diane Keaton and Shoot the Moon. I think
Mm.
she's phenomenal in that, and definitely deserved the cut in '82. And Jenna Rollins in either Another Woman or Opening Night. I kind of can't decide between those two, but she's incredible in both of those. But my ultimate just has to be for one film or another, Mia Farrow, who should have received, upwards of half a dozen Oscar nominations over the years, just somehow never made the cut. And for me, it's a really close call among Rosemary's Baby, Hannah and Her Sisters, and The Purple Rose of Cairo. And I think I lean toward The Purple Rose of Cairo being the most egregious snub, just because I think that probably is her best performance in her career. It's such a wonderfully bittersweet performance, very subtle, very moving and affecting. And I know that that was a really, jam-packed year for leading turns, but nonetheless, I definitely think she definitely deserved to be in there over, say, like Anne Bancroft and Agnes of God.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, Mia Farrow she should have been a mainstay in Best Actress, and yet she never even managed to make a blip in the category. So
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a case of, she was just constantly sixth or seventh, or if the fact that she didn't really campaign may have hurt her. I suspect it may have. But she definitely should have been a huge presence in Best Actress in the '70s. Well, more so in the '80s. But
Yeah.
yeah, for me, Farrow's got to be number one.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good choice. Yeah, as like an eternal snub, not just one year. Truly, it is. Yeah, it is very strange that it just never landed because she is kind of like in the style of what they typically liked in general in that era, and yet nothing. It's just one of those things. Not that this
It's
is
especially,
compare. Sorry.
I was going to say it's especially odd when you consider that Ruth Gordon wins Best Supporting Actress
Right.
for Rosemary's Baby,
Hmm.
and the Academy, of course, was just like bananas over everything Woody Allen in the '80s, and yet Mia just was always off to the sideline. It's very very strange.
Yeah,
I think that she obviously deserves an honorary Oscar. Whether or not she'll ever get that, or whether or not she even wants it, is
that's true.
questionable. But I suspect she probably doesn't. I don't think she really cares. But I mean, she should have been here so many times.
Hmm. Yeah. I was gonna say, not that this is comparable necessarily to Mia Farrow, but it sort of feels like what's happening with Emily Blunt right now, where
Mm,
it's just like she's always in these bigger contenders and always kind of in contention for so many things, and yet it just still hasn't happened, and it doesn't make sense that it hasn't.
right.
So yeah, sometimes there are just actresses of the era that are very popular and on paper make sense as Oscar nominees, but just they can never quite get there. There's obviously still hope for Emily Blunt, of course. She's still in the prime of her career. But yeah, that's a really, really good choice, Mia Farrow. I think that's definitely a great contender for a future episode of A Woman Robbed.
Yes,
So,
for sure.
yeah. Okay, so let's talk about this year at the Oscars. The 46 Academy Awards Best Actress nominees were Ellen Burstyn in The Exorcist, Glenda Jackson in A Touch of Class, Marsha Mason in Cinderella Liberty, Barbra Streisand in The Way We Were, and Joanne Woodward in Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams, with the winner being Glenda Jackson. So before we break down these individually, would love to just know your overall thoughts on this group of ladies.
So obviously, I adore all of them. They're all incredible actresses, and I think with one exception, they're all in terrific form here.
Hmm.
Um, I do think it's interesting. I would say that with one exception, where the performance and the film are equally fantastic, I think these are all performances that are better than the films themselves. I think in some cases they're just slightly better, and perhaps in other cases they're much, much, much better. Think it's probably notable that you have four pretty heavy dramas here and one exceedingly light comedy, which may have been a factor in terms of how this race ultimately shook out.
Mm-hmm.
But that's definitely something to note. I don't know if I would say that any of these are necessarily the greatest performances of these actresses' careers. I think that maybe in one or two cases it's arguable. I definitely think that in four of these cases they're among their greatest performances, but in terms of their all-time best, maybe, maybe not. And then I would just note that, in this category, we see a certain future Oscar nominee pop up, a certain 1987 Best Actress nominee in
Mm.
two of these films who makes
Yes,
appearances.
yes. Very
And
brief appearances. Yeah.
also would probably note the presence of Ray Stark, who was a huge
Mm.
producer at this time, and he was a producer on two of these films, The Way We Were and Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams, and was a pretty big award season player.
Mm.
So definitely some common themes there. And again, overall, I think this is a really terrific category. I think that one of these films is pretty lousy, and we'll get to that. That was a bit of a struggle to get through,
Mm.
and will probably be my last time watching that film. But
Mm.
otherwise, I quite enjoyed the other four, and I think this is one of the better lineups of the '70s for sure.
Mm. Yeah, quite a lineup we have here. I think in some ways it is a very 70s lineup in that we
Mm,
have, these actresses who got several nominations this decade, like Ellen Burstyn, Glenda Jackson, Marsha Mason. We've got three winners coming back with nominations here: Glenda Jackson, Barbra Streisand, and Joanne Woodward. I will say it does feel like a continuation of a bit of a trend that you could see from this decade, in that there's quite a few co-lead situations happening here.
mm,
I think probably Joanne Woodward is the only one I would consider the unambiguous lead of her
mhm.
film. So, but yeah, I like this group a lot, and I like that this is also a race where it seemed like it was kind of anyone's game going into the Oscars. There wasn't a super obvious front runner as far as I could tell in my research.
Right.
So And at least the nominees didn't expect things to go a certain way, which is very visible in the reaction shots on the night. So I'm excited to break that down, and I'm excited that you're here with me to discuss all these greats. So,
Yeah,
shall we get to
can't
it?
wait. Yeah, let's.
All right. Well, we're starting off with a pretty major one here, Ellen Burstyn in The Exorcist. So, Ellen Burstyn is an actress who you'll be hearing a whole lot about now on this show because this is her first of 5 Best Actress nominations. She was a nominee in supporting a few years prior for The Last Picture Show, and she'll win in 1974 for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which we'll talk about next week. So, yeah, she's all over the place in the 70s, but Ellen Burstyn, she got her start in theater and TV, as we've talked about with many nominees here, and she also joined the Actors Studio in 1967, working under Strasberg as a method actor. So she's very much a part of that scene, and one of the more prominent women, I think, associated with the Actors Studio. And now, all these years later, she's the co-president there, alongside Alec Baldwin and Al Pacino. So she's always taken her craft very seriously. Not to say that others that we'll talk about haven't, but she's a big proponent of kind of immersing herself in her characters to really understand their motivations, things like that. And that's part of what likely helped her greatly when filming The Exorcist. And there's obviously a lot that we could talk about with this movie, kind of like as a social phenomenon and, you know, its place in the history of horror, the fact that it was basically like a cursed production. We talked about a lot of that on the Best Picture series for the 73 episode with Cody Derricks, which I would encourage people to go back and listen to. Maybe we could bring some of that up here, but I think it's also worth noting that Ellen Burstyn was pretty far down the list of actresses who were sought to play this role of Chris MacNeil, and they were hoping to get either Audrey Hepburn, Anne Bancroft, or Jane Fonda. All 3 of them either had certain demands or they just dismissed it outright in the case of Jane Fonda. Shirley MacLaine, Carol Burnett was even in the mix. And then Ellen Burstyn gets involved, and she really advocated for herself, saying she was basically destined to play this part. And the studio was not particularly on board with her at first, but they ultimately did agree to cast her when there was basically no other bigger names who could wanted to do it. So let's see what we think of how she did. So Ellen Burstyn plays Chris MacNeil, who's an actress filming in Washington, D.C., who's staying at a house with her daughter Reagan. One day, Reagan starts to exhibit some unusual behavior, saying some dark things, you know, peeing on the floor, and her bed is shaking like crazy, and she takes on this demonic voice. So Chris takes her to every doctor that she can find who can't really provide much answers for her or treatment, and it becomes clear that Reagan might actually be possessed by a demon and in need of an exorcism. So let's talk Miss Ellen Burstyn. Andrew, what are your thoughts on the great Ellen Burstyn and her performance here in one of the most iconic films of all time, wherever you want to start?
So this is the one case where I think that the film and the performance are equally magnificent. I
Yeah, I
think
thought
that
so.
Ellen
Yeah.
Burstyn is phenomenal here. One of my all-time favorite actresses, one of the all-time greats of the 70s. You know, she's been great on the big screen, amazing on the small screen. Obviously, countless stage productions, Tony Award. I mean, she's just absolutely incredible. I think that her memoir is brilliant too, and really gives a pretty amazing look at her career and her life. In this case, you know, I think The Exorcist itself holds up phenomenally. I think that it's just as terrifying as ever, and I think that Burstyn is just pitch perfect as this actress and mother who goes through the ultimate roller coaster ride. You know, at the beginning, Chris MacNeil is just the coolest person. You know, she's just this suave, confident actress who everybody's enamored with. She hosts these incredible parties. And I mean, just like imagine having Chris MacNeil as your mom. That would be the coolest thing. Having
Yep.
all of these, you know, A-listers over and, you know, Burstyn, you know, perhaps loosely playing a variation of herself as an actress is just so convincing and so winning in her early scenes. And then immediately you see that she and Linda Blair have incredible chemistry, and they ring so true as mother and daughter. They're so wonderful. And at the beginning, they have the opportunity to have some lighter moments. Burstyn gets to, tickle Linda Blair on the ground, and they have just like a fabulous back and forth. And again, they ring so true as mother and daughter. And then obviously, as the film goes on, things become more and more ominous. And, Burstyn initially is able to convey concerns and confusion. And then as the film goes on, that confusion turns to anguish and horror and just complete and utter helplessness. And Burstyn's performance is so intense, so convincing. Friedkin obviously put her through the ringer on this, arguably too much, but it certainly got one hell of a performance out of her. And, just one scene after another, she just knocks it out of the park. And again, amazing chemistry with Linda Blair, great rapport with Jason Miller, who is also brilliant in this film. I think it's one of the all-time great horror movie performances. And I'm so glad that it was recognized, because obviously there is an anti-horror bias with the Academy, which did, I think, come to fruition when it came to winners. But thankfully, at least at nomination time, they did recognize this and Burstyn's performance.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, I love Ellen Burstyn. I love how committed she is, especially in going to some really dark places, like in this, and especially in Requiem for a Dream, which we'll get to in 30 years. She's often kind of popping up on TV in these big sort of domineering parts like House of Cards and Political Animals. She did The First Lady last year, Big Love, Flowers in the Attic, all kinds of like juicy, dramatic parts, even into her 80s and 90s now. I really just love her commitment to taking on these parts, even when they're not as big. Pieces of a Woman, also a few years ago, a great example of that. But with The Exorcist, I find that she really puts herself through the ringer in service of the story, and she absolutely makes the most of every scene that she's in, and showing how this woman who seems to know what's what, and has her life kind of set in her ways, how a woman like that would react to the unexplainable, right? We see in the beginning how she's like very self-assured. She's got her house with her servants and her only child, and she's clearly this woman of conviction who knows her craft as an actress. She's been doing it for a while, and like you said, she does also have this nice, easy chemistry with Linda Blair, and you can see just from the way she is around her that she's just her whole world, that there's no one else that she truly cares for as much as her daughter. And there's also, I think, kind of an indication that she may be sort of casually dating her director, but for the most part, she's focused on her work and her daughter, and that really registers in her performance, especially with her being so serious about her craft. And I think even though a lot of what she's ultimately doing along the way is reacting to what's going on with her daughter, you still get this really strong force of character. And even though she's also playing an actress, she never comes across as phony or like cartoonish. She's never playing it this as like a sort of cheap horror movie camp type of thing. Like, she's sort of playing this as a harrowing drama, essentially, about this mother who just can't wrap her head around what's happening to her daughter, and it scares her to know that she can't help her. She can't provide her own sort of treatment for her daughter, so she has to call on these other people to try to fix the situation. And we're just sort of seeing her losing her mind, losing her patience, because it's like nothing's working. And then when she has to make that decision to consult the priests and do the exorcism, it's not easy for her, because she's also not a believer, and that's another big part of it too. And I just can't imagine, like, even some of the other actresses that I listed before who I love, I can't imagine them really fitting into the atmosphere of the film, like that constant state of dread. Maybe Anne Bancroft, but I don't know. I just think there's like a level of star power maybe with the others that would have maybe distracted from the story. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's fascinating to imagine Audrey Hepburn or Carol Burnett doing this, just because I feel like that could be a grand slam or just completely miss the mark and be totally miscast. It's interesting to fathom. I can't imagine Jane Fonda in this role. I think she reads as a little bit too young
Yeah.
for this character. I think that Anne Bancroft certainly could have worked, but it's just like, I mean, Ellen Burstyn's just so perfect that it's hard to, want anything else. I imagine, Bancroft could have done a perfectly serviceable, potentially even great job, but Burstyn is just fantastic here. So amazing. And you can tell that this is going to be a triple performance pretty early on. There's this fantastic scene where Chris, and this is before the bed starts shaking and all these other occurrences, where Chris tries reaching her ex-husband on Reagan's birthday, and she just has this explosive conversation on the phone. She's just, totally losing it, and you can tell just how much she cares for and loves and revolves her life around Reagan, and that when problems happen on the horizon, that she is going to be the ultimate advocate for Reagan. I mean, there's just one scene after another where Burstyn is just so fiery and just chomping down on the screenplay, and obviously just so invested in these proceedings. Just so great.
Yeah. And I read that I did take the Ellen Burstyn memoir out of the library just to see what she said about this experience. She has obviously a lot to say about The Exorcist, but one thing I sort of keyed in on is this one quote she had in terms of preparing for the role. She said, I wanted to chart Chris's consciousness, wanted her to begin the film unawakened to any other realm of existence except the material, the world that she perceived with her five senses. Slowly, during the course of the film, she would be forced to confront the existence of a far greater mystery. I wanted her to do battle completely ill-equipped to deal with the malevolent forces of the unseen world. So I selected a good luck charm that she always wore, a small horseshoe dangling on her wrist. I wore it in every scene. And that is quite visible in certain scenes. I did make note of that. And yeah, she does truly just, it seems like this character is kind of in her skin, and maybe it is the fact that she is playing this committed actress that it wasn't like a huge stretch, but I really respect the amount of effort and work that she put into it, even though it doesn't feel effortful.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's early scenes where she's filming outside in Georgetown, and then obviously at the party where it's kind of like, oh, maybe this is kind of what Ellen Burstyn was like in real life, so it's kind of
Right.
like a documentary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if that was the entire performance, obviously this wouldn't be receiving a nomination. But as the film goes on, she's just greater and greater. And I think some of the best and most affecting and heartbreaking scenes are actually the ones with Burstyn and the doctors, at the
Mm-hmm.
hospital as Reagan's undergoing all of these, terrible surgeries and tests, and they're so unrelentingly intense and sad, and she just looks so horrified and so helpless, and her rapport with the doctors, grows more and more hopeless and agitated as it goes on, that she increasingly knows the doctors are not going to come to a resolution. But what, else is there? Is she
Right.
just going to lose Reagan? Is there nothing that can happen? She looks more tired, more anguished, helpless, hopeless. She's just so amazing. And those hospital scenes, I think, are some of the scariest of the film. Obviously the scenes in the bedroom are, classic horror and iconic, but just watching this poor girl undergo these terrible tests and
Mm.
how
Yeah.
bloody it all
The
is,
thing
it's
with the
just,
neck, and it's just, yeah.
oh, it's awful.
Yeah,
The
it
person's
really
just
is.
incredible.
Yeah. I mean, when things really start to obviously take that turn, there's like this gravitas I find that, just in her voice, even how she expresses herself, that really makes you feel the stakes of what's happening. Like when the doctor is saying, like, it's all just in her daughter's head, even though she knows that the bed was shaking, it was not her daughter. So she's having to kind of grapple with the fact that she knows there's something especially wrong at play that's beyond the doctor's understanding, and it's really just rattling her, and it just gets, worse and worse as time passes, and Reagan is just fully into that other character at that point, like when she's flying around on the bed and she's just kind of watching and helpless, and having to watch her child go through something that she just can't even wrap her head around. She can't explain it. I was curious if you had any thoughts on the themes in terms of, like, we see many times over the course of the film how she's saying things like "God damn it" and like "for Christ's sake," and these kind of like things that are blasphemous, quote unquote, in terms of the Christian theology of everything. What you make of that sort of underlying theme.
Yeah, I mean, there was that great moment early on where she spots Karis, Jason Miller, just outside and is just so intrigued by him. But when the doctors bring religion into it all, her immediate reaction is, "So I should bring Reagan to a witch doctor, you're saying?"
Right. Right.
There's no religion there. She's definitely not somebody who goes to church or
Mm-hmm.
has been, involved in religion. She almost strikes me as somebody whose parents were perhaps more religious and she kind of went in the other direction purposefully. But yeah, I mean, those themes are obvious. And at the time, a lot of folks in the religious community were actually quite taken with the film because it, of course, portrays the church and priests and exorcists
Right.
as
Mm-hmm.
heroes. So, yeah, I mean, interpretations of this film, could go, in many different directions. But yeah, obviously, those themes, religion, and having to turn to something which you've previously had no connection or feeling for, it's so, it just resonates so much. It's so great. And I think that, well, I think possibly her best scene in the whole film is her walking with Karis outside. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
particularly great scene because Burstyn has to convey all these emotions while wearing these huge sunglasses, which is never
Uh-huh.
easy. But she is able to convey all this feeling and emotion and desperation while her face is largely covered. And I mean, at this point, she's just so desperate and has finally conceded that, okay, this may be the only route to turn to this priest, to this so-called witch doctor, and that this could be it. After this, there are really no options.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's just so heartbreaking in that scene, and I think it might be her best in the film.
Yeah, I love that scene. I also love this sort of quieter scene too that she has with Lee J. Cobb
Mm,
as the detective who's trying to get to the bottom of this homicide that was very likely caused by her daughter, and her sort of gradually realizing that, yeah, it was definitely her daughter, but not wanting to sort of hint at that, at anything really in front of him, to basically just protect her daughter and her family, and just sort of keeping it together in that very tense, quiet scene. And then just after he leaves, just breaking down. I just found that to be so well done.
oh yeah, and I mean, there's such a subtle sense of dread in that scene, just
Yeah.
because you can see in her face that she's gradually realizing what went down. I mean, perhaps she knew beforehand, but at this point, she's just increasingly convinced that Reagan killed Burke. And then, of course,
Mm-hmm.
right after that is one of the most horrifying scenes in the whole film with
Yeah.
Reagan attacking Chris. And I believe that's
Mm-hmm.
the scene in which Burstyn was injured, and she
Yeah.
certainly looks like she's being injured. It's just a
Mm.
horrifying scene. So that sequence is just incredible. It's both her most subtle acting and the most extravagantly terrifying scene of the film, arguably.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, she lands the subtlety of that, and then the physicality of the scene right there. And yeah, it did cause, I read, like, permanent damage to her, which is unfortunate. I mean, there's many cases of certain things taken too far on the set of The Exorcist with other actors as well. I do not want to sort of justify any of that by any means, but you definitely feel the reality of that in many cases. And then with Jason Miller, just how terrified he is because of William Friedkin like firing blanks on the
Mm.
set, which is an interesting directorial choice. But yeah, she's just fully committed to it. And like I said, I feel like she really does take it so seriously as a film and never thinks of it as this is just going to be a sort of silly movie where her daughter is putting on this demonic voice and everything. Like she, it feels like a story of a helpless mother who can't fix what's happening with her daughter or can't understand it. And there's obviously some other writings that have been had about like what exactly that means in terms of feminism of everything, and just like a mother trying to explain like what's happening with her daughter, and that she might, like, this is like a puberty kind of analog. Like there's so many different analogies that have been put in place of what exactly all of this means, but she is always just playing the reality of the situation, and she's never sort of feeling like above the character, or like looking in on the outside and playing her as a flawed person. She just kind of is that person. It's very kind of technical stuff, but you can see where the training is paying off, I think. Unfortunately, towards the end, she does kind of taper off as the exorcism is taking place and she's just waiting downstairs. Do you feel like any of that kind of lessens the impact of her performance?
I think to an extent it does. I never considered potential like category confusion with this performance, but watching it and seeing how she's so sidelined in that final half hour, I could see somebody walking away from this film, not convinced that she's a clear lead. I think she is definitely more lead than supporting, just because she is such a center. I mean, such a focus of the center of this film. Obviously, the beginning is bookended, with the scenes in Iraq, and then obviously the final half hour in the bedroom. But she's such a focus of the middle of the film that I think it's a little challenging to argue that she's supporting. But
Yeah.
you walk away from the film, I think, thinking more about the horrific events that just happened in that bedroom than you do of the amazing performance that preceded that.
Yeah.
Obviously, as like an actress lover and as an Ellen Burstyn fan, I walk away with Burstyn clearly in mind. But I could see audiences back in the day leaving the film distracted by the events that happened toward the end over the amazing performance that Burstyn gave before that. So I do think she has a couple great moments. I think when she approaches Jason Miller downstairs and asks, is it over? Is Reagan going to die? I think that's
Right.
incredibly powerful. And then the final scene of them leaving the house toward the end, she's terrific in that. But most of the Burstyn content is in the middle of this film, not the beginning, not at the end. I do think it is a leading turn overall. I think that her going down to supporting would probably be category fraud. Not quite Tatum O'Neal category fraud, but still questionable. Nonetheless, she's just phenomenal in this.
And no, I think that Ellen Burstyn is a lead. I would argue co-lead with Jason Miller.
Mm,
I think that's the real category fraud here that we're talking about.
yeah.
I think Jason Miller really leads quite a bit of the story, and obviously has so much of the climax to himself in a way, with Max von Sydow too. But still, yeah, I think they're both co-leads. We didn't get this question in the Twitter questions. Do you consider Linda Blair a lead?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
Because that's, people have said that too.
I don't think that she has. I think people are convinced she has more screen time than she actually has.
Yeah.
I didn't look at what the screen time count on this was, but I would think that she's probably in maybe a quarter to a third of the film. I'm not sure. I don't have Screen Time Central up right now, but I think that she's in less of it than people remember her being, and she's in very very little of it. Pre makeup and so on. But yeah,
Yeah.
I don't consider Linda Blair a lead. I think that they probably should have tried to get nominations in all four categories, placed Miller in lead. That almost surely would have given Von Sydow the slot in supporting, and then they
Yeah.
could have potentially gotten four. I know Miller wasn't a huge A-lister. It could have been a challenge for him to get the lead nomination, but given just what a phenomenon this movie was, I think it's plausible it could have gotten all four acting noms.
Yeah. And I wonder, I don't really think that any of them would have won. But
No, no.
yeah, would have been a Sunset Boulevard situation, I think.
I think that Linda
Um,
Blair could have won if the Mercedes McCambridge controversy didn't come to
mm,
fruition. I think had
right.
folks found out about all of that after the fact, perhaps Linda Blair could have gone all the way. Although I still
Hmm.
think that Tatum O'Neal category frauding in a much more accessible film probably would have still
Right.
made her the favorite there.
I think so. Yeah. And for the record, Linda Blair has 29 minutes in The
Oh,
Exorcist.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's 24% of the screen time of the
Mm.
film. So, yeah, I also think that she is supporting, that she's not driving this story, really. That's why I think both Jason Miller and Ellen Burstyn are co-leads and driving the narrative here. But anyway, I think I just wanted to kind of end on this other quote that Ellen Burstyn said in her memoir, where she just talks about the going into it and filming, where she says, "I was better equipped than Chris was. I knew that we were entering the lion's den. I did not think for a moment that we could focus all our creative energies on a major battle between the forces of good and evil without attracting some very powerful energies to the enterprise." Which is a very dramatic line, Ellen, but I think is probably, yeah, but she kind of knew what she was getting into with this, so she was definitely prepared for all of the discourse, I imagine.
Yeah, and for Friedkin at this point already had a reputation as being a pain in the ass, so
Yeah.
she had to know.
Hmm. So anyway, I'm glad that we could talk about a rare horror performance nominated in this category, because I feel like it's in the single digits in terms of Best Actress. So that's all I've got on Ellen Burstyn, unless you have anything else.
No, no, I'm great.
All right. Let's move on to Marsha Mason in Cinderella Liberty. So this is going to be another one of those actresses who we focus on for multiple episodes during a very short window of time when the Academy was really into them. Marsha Mason gets 4 Best Actress nominations over the course of 9 years, from 1973 to 1981. And her other nominations after Cinderella Liberty are all with Neil Simon, who was her husband during that time. So Cinderella Liberty is an outlier in that respect. But Marsha Mason, she was born in Missouri. She went on to do theater work. She was in daytime soaps like Dark Shadows and Love of Life. And she had done a few minor film roles in film, but 1973 was really the breakout year for Marsha Mason. She was also in a movie called Bloom in Love. She also meets and marries Neil Simon this year, and then she wins this coveted role in Cinderella Liberty and gets her first Oscar nomination. So the film is about sailor John Baggs, played by James Caan, who is on leave for a minor surgery, and his records are temporarily lost, and that kind of allows him to put down roots in Seattle for a little bit, where he meets this sex worker named Maggie, played by Marsha Mason, who has an 11-year-old son, and we see how the two of them develop feelings for each other, and he intends to sort of provide for them, but there are these obstacles that come in the way of him doing so. So let's talk Marsha. Andrew, thoughts on Marsha Mason and her first Oscar nomination here?
Well, I love Marsha Mason, overall. I grew up on the Neil Simon comedies. My mom always had
Mm-hmm.
like Chapter 2 or The Goodbye Girl on. I think we had them both on VHS. So Marsha Mason was definitely part of my upbringing. And, I know that she might honestly be the most forgotten Best Actress nominee who had, 4+ nominations, which I
Yeah.
think is a shame because I think she's a really, charming and lovely actress. So I definitely have a history of growing up with Marsha Mason and have also loved her work, on TV. She had a wonderful arc on Frasier. As John Mahoney's girlfriend for a season, and she was fabulous on that. And she, still pops up on Grace and Frankie and other shows. I think that Cinderella Liberty is much different from most of her other projects. I think that this role and this film are very much a 180 from the more sanitized and kind of sitcom Neil Simon comedies that she did. I think that this is a much grittier film and a much grittier character. I don't love Cinderella Liberty itself. I think it's kind of a middling film, and I think it's probably more of a James Caan vehicle than it really is a
Yeah.
Marsha Mason vehicle. This is another one where I could almost see, is she lead? Is she supporting? Is she a co-lead? Ultimately, I think she is kind of a co-lead and not really supporting. But I think that she leaves a really strong and lovely impression in this. I think that, in the beginning, when James Caan first meets Marsha Mason. The character, she's just so delightfully flirtatious and playful, and she has a great laugh. And I think that she and James Caan have a really wonderful rapport in this film. I think they actually have much better chemistry in this than they do in Chapter 2, which isn't really the greatest. But I think that Marsha Mason has, a lot of great scenes in this. I think she has several really, truly moving scenes with James Caan. I think she's able to play both comedy and drama really quite wonderfully in this. Again, I don't adore the film. There are, several scenes that are just focused on Caan and or a character played by Eli Wallach in this, who I really don't think is that great. A lot of that stuff I really couldn't care less about. But when the film is focused on Marsha Mason, I'm very much engaged. I think she's in terrific form. I wouldn't say this is necessarily her best work, but I do think that it's important because it serves as a testament to her range and as a testament to the fact that she could do great roles without Neil Simon. And frankly, I wish she
Yeah.
did more roles without Neil Simon, because I think that she is a really talented dramatic actress and could do, as you can see here, much more than the kind of, middle-brow sitcom stuff that her husband was known for. So
Right.
overall, I don't think this film is really a vehicle for her. It's much more a vehicle for Caan, but nonetheless, it's a really nice early showcase of her skills.
Yeah. I'll just say on that, I think she is just barely a co-lead. I
Mm.
think like she has like a few scenes extra to justify her being in this category. But yeah, I really like Marsha Mason. I like how she just seems so quintessentially 70s to me
Mm.
in like her style, her sensibility. She's very New York actor's actor, even though she's from Missouri. But she brings this kind of a warmth to a lot of her parts, I think, without really looking like she's putting in a lot of effort. Like it seems to come very naturally to her, but there's also sometimes a bit of that hard edge when the role requires it. Either way, I think there's just a human quality that I enjoy from her. I think she's great in The Goodbye Girl, which we'll get to with her next nomination. But yeah, actually, Cinderella Liberty I had not seen before this. So first of all, what an underrated James Caan performance. I think he was such a loss losing him last year. There's just this great sort of sensitive energy that he brings to this, plus just that like natural James Caan masculinity. It's just the perfect combo. And even though this is his story, very much so, I think he's very well matched by Marsha here. And this is a very standard trope, as we know, the hooker with a heart of gold thing. But she does give her humanity, and it doesn't feel forced at all. Like, even from that first scene where we're introduced to her by way of her butt, that first scene, she kind of is like loose and casual. She's a guy's girl, that kind of thing. She doesn't seem to voice any objection when she's being sexually harassed, at least not in her response to it. But she kind of is making it all light, and she's just got this cool confidence, and she's really responding to this sort of playful sparring from James Caan. And like you mentioned, she does have that great kind of open laugh that is kind of infectious. And it's a really big first impression. I guess there are other actresses who could have played it that I think that could have been not the greatest first impression because she's making big choices, but it still feels pretty natural. And I think they have this really great sort of sexual charge between them that is pretty convincing in this category where we do have other kind of stories about lovers. I think this one feels the most natural to me.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that they definitely have like the hottest chemistry in this
Yeah,
category. I mean, we'll get to Streisand and Redford, but and
right.
a duo that I adore, but there's not a ton of heat there. There is
Right.
genuine heat between Khan and Mason here.
There's like a
Uh,
lust. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I love the scenes of them just walking Seattle at this time. I think this is, I mean, it might be like the greatest like '70s Seattle movie. Just the
Mm.
grit and the character of the city at the time, and I could just watch them, converse and walk the streets forever. I mean, they're so engaging, and right from the beginning, they have such a fun, flirty, sexy chemistry.
Yeah.
And I mean, as much as I love, like, Richard Dreyfuss and Marsha Mason and The Goodbye Girl, I don't think she ever had, a screen partner quite like Khan. They hit it off, right away. And again, there's just like a sensuality between them that's so wonderful. And Khan is indeed so terrific in this, and I think he would have been a very, richly deserved Best Actor nominee.
Yeah, and you mentioning the whole thing of them just walking through Seattle, it sort of does just make me wish that this was just like a before sunrise kind of thing,
Mm,
where it's just the two of them talking and walking and just getting to know each other and talking about love and life and all that stuff.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, they just have a really good rapport. I don't love the overall plot here, and there's a bit of a shagginess with trying to balance certain stories, and it's yeah, like you kind of were saying, not the most compelling film that we're going to talk about here, but the two of them, there's no fault on their parts. They're bringing a lot of energy to a film that can be pretty sedate
Yeah.
sometimes.
I mean, I like a lot of the scenes between James Caan and Kirk Calloway, who plays Marsha Mason's son. I think that the
Hmm.
Calloway's quite terrific in this, but there is a lot of stuff with the Eli Wallach character, and that just really doesn't do a whole lot for me. I
Yeah.
think they were trying to make him sort of a scene stealing, potential like best supporting actor nominee, but it turns the focus away from Mason, and for me that's just a thumbs down.
Yeah, I would agree. The part with her son isn't very interesting. How she doesn't really care that her son is like having drank beer since he was a baby. She says at one point, and he kind of is. The James Caan character is kind of chastising her for being a bad mother, and I like that she doesn't really overplay how much those words affect her. She does call him a prick, but she's not going to give him the satisfaction of being too kind of influenced by him, especially because they barely know each other at that point when they're having that conversation. But she seems very much like a woman who is just kind of driven by instinct and kind of knows who she is, even if outside people have a certain judgment on her and her choices and her parenting skills and her line of work and all that stuff. She's just like, I'm just going to go about my business.
Yeah.
And like I was saying with Ellen Burstyn, it doesn't feel like she's standing outside of the character in judgment of who she's playing.
Yeah, I mean, she's so comfortable in her own skin, and she has, I think, instilled that confidence in her son, and trusts that he can, go out into this gritty world and he'll be fine. She can kick ass, and she's raised her son in a way where he's able to more than, fend for himself. So
Yeah.
I think they have I think that she and Kirk Calloway ring very much true, and are wonderful. But I think that, we've talked a lot about, the flirtatiousness of her performance and the charm of it, but she has many more affecting, even heartbreaking moments as the film goes along. There's a great scene, like toward the middle, where James Caan and Marsha Mason are just lying in bed together, and he notices a scar
Yes.
that's on her, and that's an incredibly moving moment, and she plays it in a very subtle, nuanced way, very very moving. And I think that as the film goes along, and this character ultimately she deals with a pregnancy, I think that her entire labor and delivery is honestly one of the most convincing and intense deliveries that I've seen on film, and she plays it, just so convincingly and beautifully. Her performance, again, it can be very light and just easy breezy, but it could also be incredibly intense and moving and just deeply affecting. So I think this film, much in the same way that it stands as a testament to a range, comparative to her later work, within this film itself, you know that she's a great comedic actress and dramatic actress.
Yeah. And I'm glad that the Oscars took notice of that right away. And, that scene that you mentioned with her in bed, and he's kind of telling her about his sort of moral code where he doesn't like lying and he would never hit her. And I love how much that causes this kind of emotional response in her when she is revealing that scar that she presumably got from a bad encounter with a man. And she's, yeah, that it's a very tender scene. But she's also kind of wondering if this relationship is going to be for the long run. But she's kind of emphasizing that she'll be here if he's willing to put in the effort, even though, as we see towards the end, things take a different turn where he is kind of willing to do that, but she decides to go on a different path. But yeah, all of the stuff with, you know, the pregnancy, as you mentioned, is really quite just like visceral, natural acting to me that does not feel glamorized at all. And then this sort of grief of her getting the call of what's happened to her baby is very, very wrenching stuff. And later saying that, like, she has this one line a little bit after that, still in her grief, where she's saying sometimes it's just you're better off not being born, you know, so you don't have to deal with all of this. And that's kind of her way of coping with this situation. And then she ultimately is turning back to sex work, regardless of what, you know, the James Caan character thinks of her decision. And she is really just able to show how Maggie is kind of convinced in her decision making and how it makes sense to her at the time, even if it's not something that is fulfilling to her in the long run. Did you have any other thoughts on, like, you know, the decision that she makes in the end to leave the two of them for New Orleans?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, not unlike in The Exorcist, I think that her absence in the final, I mean, it's not half hour, but her absence in, let's say, the final 10 minutes, you ultimately, I think, leave the film more so thinking about James Caan than you do Marsha
Yeah.
Mason. But nonetheless, yeah, I mean, there is I mean, at once this character is so confident and comfortable in her own skin, but on the other hand, you know, she's so aware of the realities out there, and I think that she feels a sense of helplessness if she stays in Seattle. I think that I don't know, and I feel like she would know that ultimately Han and Calloway will come after her and go to New Orleans. I almost kind of wish that we could follow these
Mm.
characters a bit more, or that we had a
Yeah.
sequel so we could just keep following them, because I think that that whole dynamic among the three of them would be so fascinating to watch. It almost feels a little bit anticlimactic in the way the film ends. I really wish it followed through even more. So again, I don't find this film overall to be the most satisfying, but just as a vehicle for both Khan and a showcase for Mason, I think it works quite well.
Yeah.
But all of the stuff with the losing the baby, it's so heart wrenching, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
Mason is just plays it so subtly in a way that another actress perhaps would have gone a little overboard.
Yeah, I think the ending definitely just leaves you on like a, okay, I guess we're just gonna kind of leave us in this liminal space of just like not exactly knowing what might happen next. But and at the same time, that feels very 70s ending to me.
Yeah,
In terms of, like, you know, we're out of the Hays Code and now we can leave audiences on that more ambiguous note. I know just from also reading Marsha's memoir, her talking a little bit about this film, she did not particularly love the ending here, and she kind of wishes that she could have a little more closure with the character because it's very much left open ended, which I understand. And I kind of want the same thing. I do wish we could check in on her and that this was a true co-lead, kind of like we're checking in on both James Caan and Marsha Mason, whereas as we end it, it's just like, okay, this was just the story of James Caan's character. It's not fully about her, but again, sort of like screen time wise and presence wise, I think she makes so much of the material that she does have that she feels right in lead at the same time.
we agree with you, Marcia. If you're
Yes,
listening.
agree. Yes, yes, for sure. Looking forward to covering her work with Neil Simon in the future, but this was a very good one to start with.
And we should also note that this is the first of many Best Actress nominations that Mark Rydell directed.
Hmm,
He was kind of a
good point.
mainstay in this category with The Rose and On Golden
Hmm.
Ponds and The River and For the Boys to come.
Yeah, yeah,
So, A lot of Rydell stuff.
I can't wait for Mark Rydell to be one of my most watched directors over the
So,
next year or two. All right, shall we move on to Miss Barbara?
oh boy, yes.
Okay, a lot to unpack. All right. Barbra Streisand in The Way We Were. So, yeah, this is a pretty big one. I don't know if this still counts as like Afterglow, but it is yet another example of a Best Actress winner getting that follow up nomination pretty shortly after her win. Maggie Smith, Glenda Jackson, Sophia Loren, Anna Magnani. Like, there's quite a few examples of this, and Barbara here, no exception, even if it did take a few extra years to get there. But she's continuing to release albums and star in movies in between Funny Girl and The Way We Were. She does The Owl and the Pussycat, What's Up, Doc? There's also Hello, Dolly right after Funny Girl. All films that she was presumably in the mix for to get another nomination, but The Way We Were is ultimately what did it, and it remains her most recent acting nomination, although she later wins an Oscar for writing Evergreen from A Star is Born, which, if I'm remembering correctly, I just talked about on the latest A Woman Robbed episode, so there's some nice timing there. But The Way We Were is a film that allowed Barbara to really sort of key into her assertive personality and her passions and her advocacy and, work alongside one of the hottest men in the industry in Robert Redford. So the film is about Katie, played by Barbara, who is this fierce political activist during the 30s through the 50s, and she meets Hubble, played by Robert Redford, who is basically a wasp, as waspy as it gets, and privileged and not very political, but also a very talented writer who sells a novel, and the two of them form a relationship over time, and a lot of the conflict comes from their sort of ideological battles and sort of focusing on the strengths and the flaws of both of their sort of philosophies, with her advocacy sometimes getting in the way of her making friends, and then him being so agnostic to the whole thing that he hardly ever takes a stand on anything. So let's talk about Miss Barbra Streisand, Andrew. Having known you for a while, I know that Babs is one of your faves. So tell me your thoughts, if you want to get into overall on Barbara and what you think of her here in The Way We Were.
So this is my mom's all-time favorite movie, so this
Yeah,
was
there's many moms' all-time faves.
constantly on. I vividly remember I must have been 5 years old, and watching the scene in which Katie, where Hubble's in Katie's bed, and Katie disrobes, and her long red fingernails, and just kind of,
Yes.
I mean, I remember vividly that scene just over and over again, and other scenes too, but just as a 5-year old, I was like, what is this? But I grew up in a household where both my parents and my grandparents actually constantly had Barbara's albums on in the background, the Broadway album and some of her 60s stuff. And I mean, Barbara was just such a mainstay growing up. And The Prince of Tides and all of her other movies. My grandparents loved Nuts. That was one of their favorite movies. So Barbara, my upbringing was, always there.
Raised by Barbara.
Yes. The Way We Were, it's such a movie star performance. It's just the quintessential movie star vehicle. And Barbara she couldn't be more perfect in it. I mean, right from the beginning in the scene, which takes place the movie goes through many, many decades, but right away she looks so ravishing, and she approaches everything right from the get-go with such zest and fervor and energy. And the moment that Katie spots Hubble at the ball, and the music's of course swelling in the background. It's such movie magic. And then
Cinema.
following that up with the opening credits, which it so beautifully sets the tone and spotlights both Streisand and Redford. You just know you're in for such an iconic romance. And I mean, Katie she can be a handful, but she's such also just an irresistible and engaging character. And Streisand, again, she just approaches it with just such determination, and she's able to sell even the most saccharine of dialogue in a way that makes things, so heartbreaking. And I think that she and Redford, while they don't really have the kind of heat and the kind of sensual chemistry that, say, Marsha Mason and James Caan had, they're still such an iconic, irresistible couple. So I think this is a film that has its flaws. It's imperfect, especially in the second half, but it's still one of the all-time great romances, and it's a film that I can easily revisit and, pick up something new. And that ending, still packs such a punch. So it's a film that I've been raised on and seem to revisit on an annual basis, but it doesn't get old, warts and all.
Yeah. So I think when you look at The Way We Were, and if you know Barbara's specific persona, I think it's probably tempting to say that she's not doing a whole lot of stretching here. For me, I've reached a point, especially in doing this show, where there are different styles of performance that I value depending on how they are contributing to the film that they're in, which may sound like a very obvious statement, but certain films really do call for certain styles. And when you have a romantic drama of this nature, which has those kind of swoony elements in between the political battles, I don't mind that she is not transforming into someone else here. This does feel to a large extent like an extension of Barbara, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it really works kind of perfectly in her wheelhouse. She is hot-tempered, she's passionate, she's just bursting with ideas. In the beginning, she's being told to leave her soapbox at home just once. And she just very rarely is letting off the gas in terms of really being in that sort of confrontational person. But there's also a charm in how much she argues for her ideals, and she seems so comfortable even in that sort of constant state of wanting to go to battle, that I think it kind of freed her up in a way to be able to access the heart of the character, who I think also feels quite isolated because her fellow students and her fellow citizens really aren't as engaged politically as she is, but she can't help but be herself. And I love that the film kind of honors that. There are certainly characters around her, like Hubble, who challenge her behavior, but it doesn't feel judgmental towards her. And I love that she's able to play with intelligence, really, and showing I know that I can be difficult sometimes, but I have just accepted that about myself. So in that sense, it sort of feels very meta to me and very self-reflective in a way that others in her filmography don't quite have.
Yeah, and I much prefer her in this. She feels much more at home in this film than she does in something like Nuts or in not The Way We Were, The Prince of Tides,
Right.
which are dramas that have their merits, but I think in those films she really is trying to, just to an extent, stretch a little bit more. And I think that here she just is more at ease. She rings so true as Katie, whereas in The Prince of Tides she just kind of comes up as Barbara. And in Nuts is just a truly nuts performance, but not an altogether convincing one. She is so confident in this role. She knows Katie. She knows all of her ins and outs. I think she identifies with Katie to a great extent. I mean, Barbara obviously is very politically active herself, and I think has a lot of these views. And I imagine could have had conversations like these that Katie has with Hubble with some of her own beaux over the years. I could definitely see that. But again, she has such enthusiasm and energy, in those early scenes where she's, rallying at school and she's yelling, "Stop Franco," right to President Roosevelt today. And she has that speech in front of Hubble and all of his terrible friends. She's just so
Yeah.
irresistible, at least to me, certainly not to Hubble's friends. And I can see how others would be totally turned off by this character. But again, she just has such movie star charisma in this and is so convincing and so winning. I mean, perhaps others would disagree, but I actually think that she and Redford kind of ring true enough as college students. I mean, maybe there's a Grease effect where they're a little bit too old, But for me, I'm not totally taken out of it.
Yeah, this is not like Stockard Channing in Grease per se.
No, no, no.
Yeah, I kind of just go with it. I know that it's not really going for realism
Yeah.
here. Like I understand what the film is, so I just kind of accept that part of it. But yeah, those earlier scenes, like when she's getting to know him more, and I believe she calls him decadent and disgusting, is a great line. But I think another part of her, which is sort of unsaid but very visible, I think, is just how unbelievably attractive he is, and how much they enjoy sort of lightly sparring with each other. So then, like that kind of sweet conversation that they have when she crosses the street, which is this running gag, and he tells her about selling his novel, and she's talking more about her causes that she's passionate about. They just have this really charming dynamic that, yes, maybe doesn't feel that lusty as Cinderella Liberty, but Streisand and Redford, these two incredible movie stars coming together, and it's like at a certain point, even if they don't have a lot in common necessarily, they just kind of weirdly fit together in a way. So yeah, I think those earlier frizzy-haired Barbara flashbacks at the beginning are very, very charming and believable enough. I will say, just having watched Love Story a few weeks ago, this sort of feels like this is a film that was greenlit after the success of Love Story,
Yeah.
and yet this is doing so much with the kind of dynamic of a man and a woman who meet and have this kind of like love saga, this kind of like swoony thing, but does a lot more with it in terms of the political aspect of it and the differences between these two characters. And there's just more of a specificity here. I think that Love Story is like, it sort of walked so that The Way We Were could run, I suppose.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think The Way We Were is personally, I think it's leaps and bounds more
Yeah,
affecting
no,
than Love Story.
definitely.
But I love that scene when they're outside the tavern. I mean, I think that Redford has probably never looked better on the screen,
Uh,
wearing
those
his
sweaters.
sweaters.
Oh my God.
And I think Streisand's never looked better. I think she looks wonderful in this. And I have to say, I know we're not talking about like best director, but I think that Sidney Pollack does a really nice job directing the film. I love the
Yeah.
shots of when they're at the school dance. I think it's the final of the flashback scenes where they've danced together and then Redford just fades into the distance and she's just looking
Hmm.
on. And then it transitions into present day with the two of them. I think that's just so masterfully done.
Also, when we do get back to the present, their kind of reuniting moment, I think, is really, really beautiful. When I also love when they go back to her place
Mm,
and he's clearly just like out of it.
yeah.
And he takes off his clothes and gets in her bed. And the way she kind of navigates the sexual tension of that is pretty steamy, not gonna lie.
Yeah. But then she's like, Hubble, it's Katie. You do know it's me, don't you? So
Yeah.
it's like she's not sure if he even knows, what's going on, and that creates a whole
Right.
different element to this. But Katie leading up to that, she's just so equal parts exhilarated, but also so anxious at having Hubble in her own home. Like this is like her dream
Yeah.
come true. I think that Streisand just expertly conveys all of that. And then I think it might be the next scene or the scene after where Hubble's going to be coming over for dinner and just how excited she is for that. And she goes and she gets like all the steaks and the baked potatoes and all of that stuff. She's just so over the moon excited. And it's a dream come true that she never thought would actually come to fruition.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, what are the odds that you stumble upon this man who was like that brief encounter
Yeah.
all those years ago? And here he is again in your home, and now he's in your bed naked. And what do you do? That's, yeah, really, really good stuff. And obviously, when they go to this party where she clearly isn't fitting in and she can't help but to express her opinions,
Mhm.
it's like she's one of those people who hates small talk and like the stupid jokes that people make. She just wants to discuss real things that matter, And I've known a lot of those people over the years, and this it definitely rings true. And for as much as I may agree with a lot of her stances and what she's fighting for, I think that the film is well balanced enough to make us understand where they're both coming from. And yeah, I just think she really plays into that stubbornness really well without going too far into it and being just like impossible and like grating,
Yeah. And she's like, I want to get out of this party. And then Redford's like, all right. And then she's like, I meant us. We should leave.
Right. Jeez, in front of everyone,
I know.
this argument. Oh
She's
God.
she's so pissed because they're not celebrating FDR's death, but they just don't seem to give a shit.
Right.
I mean, obviously there's hints that this may not work out earlier than that, but just the fact that she just cannot really fit into this world at all. There's just this impending doom, that there is an expiration date on this relationship, and the heartbreak is just going to be inevitable.
Yeah, I feel like the film doesn't really explicitly comment on it, but I feel like you can really feel her loneliness in wanting other people to be as passionate as her, and then even like their sort of temporary breakup fight that is after the party, where it's just like full of this fiery emotion, where she essentially is accusing him of wanting like a docile girlfriend who will just be the cool girl and laugh at all the jokes and whatnot, and she'll just never be that, and she knows herself enough to know that she cannot be that, which is then followed by this phone call scene, where she's crying on the phone about like wanting her best friend back, which is this really nice humbling moment for her. And I love when she mentions in their conversation about feeling like maybe she's not attractive enough, that she's not attractive in the right way.
Yeah.
And that's very revealing, I think. And I think is approaching that scene exactly the right way, where it's not like she's just realizing all this now. It's been like this deep down insecurity that she's always had from the start of their relationship.
Yeah, and Hubble tells her that, she doesn't have the right style, and she doesn't understand why she can't have him. And I think this dialogue, it could be hard to sell. I think it's definitely much less saccharine than something in Love Story, which is just
Yeah.
absurd. But yeah, I mean, I think that Arthur Lawrence dialogue, if sold correctly, can just be incredible. And I think that they just so expertly deliver it. And I think the phone call scene and the scene following it might be the best acting of Streisand's career, at least on a dramatic level. Just so moving, so affecting, and devastating.
It's quite emotional. I think after that point where they're kind of going to Hollywood and everything's kind of great for a while until we get the whole plot line of the McCarthyism. And naturally there's some tension there because of her past as like Marxist, which could threaten his career and everything. I'm not as in love with that part of the story necessarily. It just feels a little more plotty in a way that doesn't work for me as much as the first half.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Redford and Streisand look incredible in the Hollywood scenes. I think that they're very
Oh
beautifully
my God.
shot.
Yeah.
I love just watching them stroll the beach and talk about baby names and all of that stuff. But all the HUAC stuff, it kind of detracts from the heart of the film, which is, scenes between Redford and Streisand where they're just discussing themselves and the romance of it all. I think that the HUAC stuff just it feels a little overplotted, and it isn't really affecting or moving, and that's where this film really excels.
Right. Exactly.
I think that's toward the end of the Hollywood scenes where they've fallen apart again, and she's pregnant, and she asks if he'll stay with her until the baby's born. All of that is really heartbreaking. But there's also a lot of content in the Hollywood scenes that is, I think, just kind of flat and doesn't resonate as much as the New York scenes.
I definitely agree. And of course, he has an affair, and she is once again questioning if she's good enough or like what it is that's not working between them. I think to a certain extent with the film, there is a lot of the conflict that is repetitive in terms of like the dynamics of the scenes. It's kind of the same conversations being played out in different variations through a lot of it. But there's also just a maturity, I think, to her performance, and Redford's too, I think, that makes it feel like these people are going to be each other's person, probably forever, regardless of whether they end up together. They'll always have those past experiences, and they may never see each other again, but it's really one of those, like, we'll always have Paris type of situations. I think that they'll always have the way they were, as it were.
Yeah, and she tells Hubble, she wishes, if they were old and they could have survived all of
Yes.
this and everything would be easy, just as it was when they were young. And Hubble was like, Katie, it was never easy. It was always complicated. So
Yeah.
she won't recognize all the issues they've had. She's so convinced that they can make it, and she will do anything to be with him, but he just doesn't want her to sacrifice that. She's her own girl, and he doesn't want to change that about her.
And that's the part that feels very mature, I think, about this film as a grown-up love story, you could say. And just in another example, obviously, is that lovely final scene between them where, he's asking about their daughter and she's saying, you would be so proud of her. That's a really tender, bittersweet moment to end on, that both of them really land the kind of gravity of being in each other's orbits again, after however long it's been since they last broke up. But yeah, it's a perfect, tender final moment that once again lands a lot stronger to me than the final moments of Love Story. So there you
Oh
go. And
yeah.
you don't need to have a artificial, like, death
Yeah. And
sequence for that
unlike
to happen.
Cinderella Liberty, which kind of ends rather abruptly, this is a perfect ending that wraps
Yeah,
things
it's a
up
nice little coda.
beautifully. I know a lot of folks wish that there was a sequel to The Way We Were, that we could have followed these characters longer, but I mean, this is the perfect ending, and it's, I think, one of the all-time great endings. Incredibly moving. I know that for some folks, it just sends them drowning in tears. For me, it does choke me up a
Yes.
bit too. Um,
Hmm.
but it's so beautifully staged, and both of them look so beautiful, and it's just incredibly moving.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does kind of stand a little bit in contrast with some of the other films here, but is definitely one that is fulfilling a certain niche that is still valuable. So, yeah, love that Barbara got at least one more acting nomination to prove that it wasn't a fluke. Funny girl, and obviously she's had an incredible career, so we, even by 1968, people knew that she would be sticking around for a while. But still, love that this was another great success in her career. And it's just one of those things where I'm like, I want a late in life nomination for Barbra Streisand again.
Mm, I know. Well, she was
I
trying.
want her to return to acting, really.
Yeah.
So
Well, she was trying to get a gypsy movie off the ground for ages, but I don't think that's ever going to happen.
yeah.
Um, if she does do anything, I think it would probably be maybe a dramatic role, but I don't
Hmm.
know. And it's just crazy that she hasn't directed since 1996. That's just nuts.
Yeah. Speaking of nuts, yes.
We
um
should also note before
yes.
we move on that Sally Kirkland is in this film. She
Yes.
she plays. Her character's name is Pony Dunbar, which is a wonderful character
What a
name.
name.
I'm not sure if her name is ever said in the film, um, and maybe she had other scenes, but it's great to see her in this. And she also briefly appears in Cinderella Liberty as a woman titled Fleet Chick, who James Caan dances with before he meets Marsha Mason. So a huge year for Sally Kirkland, who was also in The Sting. So
There you go. Right.
big year.
Yeah. What a year. Very excited to eventually get to the Sally Kirkland saga.
Yes.
All right. Shall we move on to our final losing nominee, Miss Joanne Woodward?
Yes.
All right. For Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams. What a title. All right. Joanne Woodward, as previously discussed on other episodes of this show, she's fantastic. I love her, and she's thriving at this point in her career too. She's had Rachel come out in 1968, getting her second Oscar nomination there, and she does this string of films and starring roles, winning WUSA, They Might Be Giants. And then the year before this, the effect of gamma rays on Man in the Moon marigolds, which gets some traction in the awards conversation, but doesn't quite get there for an Oscar nomination. Maybe she was in the 6, 7, 8 range for 72.
Yeah.
I don't know. But there's a lot of stuff with her husband, Paul Newman, including marigolds. But then Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams does not involve Paul Newman, but it feels like kind of a spiritual sequel somehow to Rachel, Rachel. I don't know. And even though this is only 5 years after that movie, it really feels like a decidedly more mature version of Joanne Woodward. So the film is about this middle-aged housewife, Rita, played by Joanne, who is unhappy with her life, and she's kind of cold to those around her and just isn't satisfied anymore with life. And there's this hint of tension with her and her husband. She doesn't have the greatest relationship with her daughter or her mother, but especially her son, who no longer speaks to her for reasons that are uncovered later. But after the death of her mother, which happens pretty early on, it causes her to confront her past decisions and her behavior as she's at this midlife crisis point in her life. So, yeah, let's talk Joanne Woodward. How do you feel about Miss Joanne and her performance here in the rather clumsily titled Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams?
A perfect title, though. I I love. I mean, Joanne Woodward, another actress I absolutely love. Rachel, I'm a huge fan of. She's actually my winner in '68. And this is the same screenwriter, Stuart Stern. So they're reuniting on this, and then they would later do Sybil for TV later in the decade. So they had an awesome collaboration. I don't love this quite as much as Rachel. I don't think it's as well directed as Rachel was. I think that Paul Newman actually does an incredible directing job on that film. And here you have Gilbert Cates, who was probably later best known as a producer of the Oscars. Before this, he was probably best known for I Never Sang for My Father, which is another really well-acted film. And in this, I think he is able to capture some really incredible performances. And I think that this is among Woodward's best. I wouldn't say it's the best. I do think that is probably Rachel, but I think she is completely convincing in this role and has such a amazing rapport with both Sylvia Sidney toward the beginning of the film and Martin Balsam more so toward the film's second half. And I think both of them are incredible as well. So I think this is just like a really wonderful character study. I think that right from the beginning, you can tell this is going to be kind of an odd film in some ways, with that opening scene where she's having a nightmare in which she's basically in like airplane turbulence and going down. So I don't think all of the stylistic flourishes of this film always work, but this is also quite a roller coaster ride, just following this character and her relationships with her family. In a way, this character reminds me somewhat of the Geraldine Page character in Interiors. They both kind of have the same outfits, and they're going through just a lot of emotional turmoil, and the events happening in their life are just sending them further and further into this hole. Just the interaction that Woodward has with all these actors portraying her family, it can also often be really fiery, really engaging. I think the film is very well written. Again, not as well directed as Rachel, but just as, a vehicle for Woodward and for these other actors, I think it works really splendidly. And, I'm really glad she was able to get this nomination.
Yeah, definitely. And this is also, for me, a genre that I love. A domestic drama, family strife, centering on a woman, powerhouse, Oscar-winning actress in the lead.
Yep.
These are all things that appeal to me as a moviegoer. And I think there are some really powerful and very honest and truthful moments in this film, especially because of her performance. Does it all fully come together for me? Not necessarily, but yeah, Joanne Woodward is absolutely the reason to see this film. I do think to a certain extent she is typecast a little bit here, and she's in a familiar pattern that we've seen her in before, but she's so good at what she does that I would never argue with this nomination. she is, yeah, just playing this woman who is fully unengaged with her life. It's quite a bit like the beginning of Rachel, where it's clear from the start that this is going to be the story of a woman who is unfulfilled, and we're going to explore how she finds that fulfillment, or tries to find some level of happiness at least. But there's much more of a maturity here, in the sense that, she's got everything. She's got her husband, her children, her grandchild even. She's close with her mother, but she's just not excited about her life anymore. And she really slips into the skin of Rita very naturally. There's just, for me, barely a trace of this being like a performance, quote unquote. She just is this woman. And I love how unafraid she is of exploring the coldness of this character, how she just can't quite access those touchy-feely emotions, and how that tends to ostracize the people who are closest to her. And even though she's not a particularly friendly person, and she has this horrible incident in her past where she just didn't seem comfortable or couldn't handle having a gay son, and he won't speak to her, there's still also an element of sympathy that you have for her, because you can sense that she just can't help herself, and she wishes that she could find that happiness again, but she's so lost in the bitterness of everything, and her negative feelings about the world and how different the world is today compared to in the past, that she feels alienated. And that's in large part, I think, due to her intelligence as an actress, that she can give you this full portrait of a woman who could be really unpleasant, or like too remote maybe if another actress were playing her, but she just seems to get her, and she makes it feel effortless even when it's not, even when I think she may even have a more difficult task than most of the other nominees here, but you would never think that just from how kind of immersed she is in the part.
Yeah, I mean, Woodward is just such a chameleon. And, during this era, she was also doing a lot of films with Paul Newman, in which she was, really sexy and playing a younger character, not necessarily romantic comedies, but, much more hip and youthful vehicles. In this, she's able to, fit right into this older character who's kind of having something of a midlife crisis. And again, I think I especially love the first 15 minutes of this with her and Sylvia Sidney, who I think is just extraordinary as her mom.
I figured you would have you'd love this performance from her too.
Oh my
So
God,
yeah,
her voice and her smoking and her
iconic.
complaining about her
Yes.
bran muffins and oh my God,
Yes.
I could watch an entire film just focus on the two
I
of them
know.
just having lunch and going to the movies. Uh, but I think that she and Sydney have such a fabulous rapport. And I mean, spoiler alert: Sylvia Sidney's character ultimately dies,
Yeah.
and I think that there's a really deeply affecting moment where Woodward's at the hospital and she just passed away, and she holds her mom's hand. And I think that's just a beautiful moment, but it's also just, she's already in such a bad place, and this is just going to make her slip so much further into that hole. And the relationship she has with her sister and the rest of her family, just it doesn't help matters. These folks just are not helpful in the current predicament that she's facing. The film is just often, I think, overwhelmingly dark and dreary, obviously purposefully so. But, we follow her just deeper and deeper into this hole, and the flashbacks that she has to her grandmother, which are so moving. I mean,
Hmm.
she's so, so engaging. Even when the film sometimes isn't successful, like when Woodward daydreams while she's watching Wild Strawberries at the movies with her mom. I don't think that daydream really necessarily works, stylistically, but I think that Woodward otherwise is just she's just firing on all cylinders here, and it's such a great role and it's such a great vehicle for her.
Yeah. I think the film is actually pretty well written, and I would definitely differentiate that the directorial choices, I would agree, are not the best or the most fitting here. But I think even in her interactions, you can get a sense of probably how she became the person that she is today. Like everything with her mother, you could see her mother is very vain and difficult and really tough to please. So, you could see how her mother maybe is like passing down this idea of like material things in life, but isn't all that happy on the inside. And that really awful, tense moment at the graveyard with this sort of back and forth is very, you see a lot of these feelings come out, and she's just so prideful, and it's, where she's getting furious that her brother-in-law is butting into their family's affairs when it comes to selling the farm. I have to say, this scene is kind of eerily similar to a situation that I had in my own family, including the fact that it was all centered around the selling of a family farm and what to do with it. So yeah, this, I will say, is very accurate to the kind of different feelings and tensions between family members. I think those moments of just like character study, I think, are very affecting and quite bracing, honestly. Like even in this other scene with her husband, it's sort of revealed that she went to the undertaker on her way back from the hospital where her mother died. It really speaks to some of her lack of warmth and humanity, really, that she would just do that out of practicality rather than truly grieving or like letting her husband take care of it. And you feel just that bitterness and the sort of agitation that is very raw and very uncomfortable to watch at times, for me at least.
Oh yeah, and there's this amazing scene with Woodward and Dory Brenner, who plays Woodward's daughter. I think they're in the barn, and they're just tussling over the selling, and her daughter calls her a selfish bitch, and Woodward's like, "I may love you, but I don't like you at all," and it's just like such great actressing in that scene. Yeah, I mean, I think that the dialogue in this is really great, and Woodward just chews it up. She's so awesome. And then we have to say, Martin Balsam is really wonderful in this movie too, as her husband. He's really this calm and warm and very, very patient force. And I'm really kind of surprised he wasn't nominated here as well. That would have been a terrific nomination. But yeah, I mean, he's the one positive person in her life, and I just love watching them as they kind of just stroll and reminisce, and he's able to calm her down. There's that sequence where she's kind of stuck between the escalators because Rita thinks that she sees her mom, and Martin Balsam comes and he's able to calm her down, get things back to level headed again. And I just think their relationship is so fascinating, and they have so many wonderful conversations in this.
Yes, absolutely. And he also has this great monologue towards the end that is very powerful. But yeah, the whole European vacation of everything and her unraveling. And we also hear like some of her internal monologue, which is a little clunky, but yeah, the whole thing of her seeing the visions of her dead mother and other relatives. I think that's a scene that could verge into some silliness, but I really feel just like the heaviness of her life that's just weighing down on her, all of these pressures and all of these things that she hasn't properly unpacked, maybe all these sort of guilty feelings and relationships with those family members that she, maybe hasn't moved on from, and still also thinking about her son, which is a really emotional part of this film that the whole scene of her needing to be kind of calmed down, I think, is really well played. There's just this lovely moment where that's very tender of, her husband telling her about the day he first saw her and how beautiful she was to him and how now she's even more beautiful. Right. And we see that kind of softening in her eyes, even if she can't fully believe him,
That was the exact scene I was about to mention, where she asks him, I don't understand why you don't just leave and have an affair. And then he talks about how, there was this woman that he saw who had just such style and such class. And, that woman was you. It was such a beautiful and moving moment. And then, as they venture off into Belgium and Woodward learns that the Balsam character ultimately had to kill people, all of that is so haunting and impactful. I think that all of their European excursion is really, really beautifully done. And they have that wonderful dinner together, which is just,
Mm,
beautifully lit and so well performed by both of them.
yeah. And when she is just saying, I don't think we're going to hear from our son Bobby. Like, I don't think he wants to see us anymore. It's really quite raw. And her husband is saying that, he had a conversation with him last week, and that he's living with his lover in Amsterdam and he's happy for the first time in his life,
Yeah.
which really causes her to break down. She's just such a strong reactor on top of everything else, where it's like she's always so locked into her scenes, even when she's not the focus of them.
I know. And then their final scene, which I think is just the most
Mm-hmm.
heartbreaking scene of them all, where she just talks about how all of these regrets just hurt so much that she never told her mom how much she loved her. She never told her son how much she loved him. That she's unable to say what she needs to say to the people who matter the most. I mean, that's some of the
Mm-hmm.
best acting of Woodward's entire career. Um, and
Yeah,
this is one where you leave the film thinking about Woodward 100%. I mean, this
for
is just
sure.
such a fantastic vehicle for her.
One line that really is heartbreaking, even if, she is a flawed person, when she says that she wishes she could thank the people in her life for putting up with her.
Yeah, yeah,
It's just, yeah, you're really seeing this woman who's unraveling, and just like she just has so many different things circling in her mind that it does make you wonder what is next. What's the second act for Rita? Like, what does she do after this experience? I don't know. I feel like it leaves you in that really dark emotional space at the end. Even if this feels like a breakthrough for this character, it is, to go back to your favorite best actress, when it feels like the end of Come Back Little Sheba.
yeah, yeah. It really does. And what's crazy is
So
that Woodward wouldn't be back at the Oscars for almost 20 years after this. She feels like somebody who would have been, a constant mainstay, not necessarily in terms of wins, but at least nominations. But, she didn't get vehicles at this level as much as she definitely should have.
yeah. But yes, I am glad that we will have one more from her to talk about. It's crazy because I feel like I'm looking at Joanne Woodward's Oscar, run in particular, and I feel like you're seeing like this woman at these different stages of her life. Even
Mm,
if Rachel and this movie are only 5 years apart, it feels like a world of difference between those characters. And then Three Faces of Eve at the beginning is just like this bright young talent, and
mm.
then when we get Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, it's like these older, her and Paul Newman. It's like this really beautiful little charting of this woman's life and her. I don't know why it's emotional to me, just like thinking about these sort of checkpoints of Joanne Woodward in her career.
I know, I know. She's another one who's, awfully underrated. Obviously she has the win, but, she obviously doesn't have the name recognition as, say, a Barbra Streisand or even necessarily an Ellen Burstyn. I wish people would have the opportunity to go back and, revisit Rachel and Summer Witcher Dreams. This one in particular just really isn't super accessible. I mean, I think it is on YouTube, but
Yeah.
it's not one that's constantly in like the Turner Classic circulation or anything like that. So I hope people do, seek this one out, even if you have to get the DVD, because it's a terrific performance.
And also, for the record, it's pretty short. It's
Yeah,
only 90
yeah,
minutes.
yeah,
All right. Let's move on to our winner, shall we?
yeah.
I think by process of elimination, I now know who you were referring to in the beginning as the other outside of the four
Mm,
that you mentioned.
yep.
But yes, Glenda Jackson in A Touch of Class. So we have Glenda Jackson here joining a very elite group of women who have now won multiple Best Actress Oscars after Louise Reiner, Betty Davis, Olivia de Havilland, Vivian Leigh, Ingrid Bergman, Elizabeth Taylor, and Katharine Hepburn. And for me, it's the most similar to like a Louise Reiner, where they're winning two Oscars in pretty quick succession at a pretty early point in their careers. And that would also happen again later on with Jodie Foster, too. But to check in with Glenda, Following Sunday Bloody Sunday and also Mary Queen of Scots from that same year, she did a few more British dramas, including playing Lady Hamilton, and she also appeared in sketches on the Morecambe and Wise show, which was a variety show in Britain, in comedic sketches, which is what led to the director of A Touch of Class, Melvin Frank, noticing her and seeing that she could do comedy. And this is sort of a screwball comedy in the vein of those classics that we've talked about on the show in the 30s especially. So it's about a divorcee, Vicky, played by Glenda, who meets a married man, Steve, played by George Segal, in London, and they agree to have an affair. And both of them are pretty matter-of-fact about it, sort of a no-strings-attached type of agreement. And they go to Malaga in Spain for a holiday, and they quickly come to realize that this is not going to be smooth sailing. And they get into some hijinks, they bicker like an old married couple, and there's just a lot of tension in the air. But they agree to try to carry on their affair when they get back home to London, which then proves to be rather complicated when he finds that it's difficult to maintain that affair while still married. So, yes, let's talk Glenda and her second Oscar-winning performance. Thoughts on the great Glenda Jackson and her performance here?
So I should preface this by saying that I love Glenda Jackson. She's a wonderful actress. I think she's incredible in Sunday Bloody Sunday. I think she should have won for that. I saw her on Broadway in Three Tall Women. She was absolutely magnificent. Ooh. She's obviously an incredible politician. She's just brilliant. All that said, I think that A Touch of Class is a terrible film. This is I think my third time watching it, and this has to be my final time watching it because it has not improved.
I'm so sorry.
I think that this is probably the worst Best Picture nominee of the 70s. And yes, I have seen The Towering Inferno. And I think this is pretty easily the worst Best Actress win of the 70s. And possibly among, I wouldn't say it's necessarily among the 10 worst Best Actress winners of all time, because I think that she is better than the film itself, Glenda Jackson. But it's definitely in the bottom quarter of Best Actress winners for me. I just think this film, it reminds me of the worst Neil Simon films, but I think it's even worse than that. It's a cringe-inducing experience. It's never charming. It's never funny. I'm never rooting for either of these characters. I don't think they have a ton of chemistry. I think that George Segal is so insufferable in this role. I think that Glenda Jackson is at a loss of what to do with this character, with this dialogue. And brilliant as she is, I don't think she's able to do anything to really lift the proceedings at all. I think that all the slapstick comedy is just horrendous. I think they're trying to go for kind of a Blake Edwards vibe at times, which is totally flat. Most of the dialogue is awful. The beginning, the end, the middle, there's no bright spot for me. I struggle to come up with any positives in this. It's just a challenging as hell film to sit through. I had to kind of break it up into parts just because there were times where I was just flabbergasted. There are certain sequences in this that are just so baffling, just so bewildering. Did these actors think that this was good? Did the director think that was a successful sequence? Did the writer think that was sharp? It's just a confounding film all around. And much as I love Glenda Jackson, this win is just, I think we'll come to ultimately rationalize as to why she won. But when you watch this performance compared to the other four, it's just flabbergasting that this is the one that prevailed. I hate to be a negative Nancy, but this was a really tough watch for me.
Yeah, tell us how you really feel.
Yeah.
Well, I gotta say, we are in complete agreement on this episode, Andrew, I must say, because I also dislike A Touch of Class. I find these two characters to be so irredeemable and selfish, and not in a way where it's like, get a load of these assholes. And there's like a perspective to the comedy and the tension. this is just like, I find both of them to be obnoxious, and the material is just nowhere near as funny as it's trying to be. And I also don't really find their chemistry to be all that believable. I think a lot of that is on George Siegel, who I just really don't like here, like way too over the top in his approach and just not really bringing very much humanity to his part. I do think Glenda does fare better, and this is definitely not a bad performance, but I just walk away from it sort of puzzled that there was even a desire to give her an Oscar nomination for it, let alone a win. And I know I can hear people saying now that like comedy is harder to do than drama, and how people always crave these more comedic performances to get nominated and win, but they rarely do. And then when they do win, people have problems with it. I get it. I've heard the arguments. I just don't think that what Glenda Jackson is doing is anything special compared to how she normally is, which she's a great actress. We know this. But I just kind of sit here and I wonder why this was elevated to such a high level of being nominated and winning, and also getting into Best Picture when you have so many better films in 1973 they could have gone with. And it's just one of those situations where I can't even say that I dislike the win because it's a bad performance or it's a misfire or anything, because she does have good moments. I just really struggle with the material that she's given, and as much as she does help to sell some of the complexities of the character and how she's just, this woman she carries herself a certain way and is quite liberated sexually, but deep down is also vulnerable, and maybe the wounds are still fresh from her divorce. That's fine. I get all that. I just find this to be a much more shallow performance compared to what I've seen from her in the past, where I really feel like she understood those characters, like in Women in Love or Sunday Bloody Sunday, even Mary Queen of Scots, honestly. But here it feels a little bit like she's playing the character but not really living it. That's something that I've been kind of talking about a lot in terms of other nominees, where if they feel so in their characters, this is a case where it just feels like she's playing a part and she's kind of having to fulfill the expectations of being in a screwball comedy. But I don't really walk away from this feeling like I see Vicky. I see Glenda Jackson playing Vicky,
Yeah.
and giving it a valiant effort, but not fully succeeding.
I mean, she's so naturally cool and hip in this era. So, I mean, she's a pleasure to
Yeah.
watch. But the dialogue she has to deliver and the situations in which she has to act are just don't utilize her talents at all. There's this god awful sequence when they get to the hotel, and they hate all of the hotel rooms they're presented with, and they're both just so mean to this bellhop. And the situation isn't funny. They just both come off as assholes, and
Yeah.
it's just awful. And it gives you a sense of what the director and the writer think is funny. So you get similar sequences as the film goes along. There's this abysmal sequence that goes on forever and ever, in which he's in like a golf tournament against these children, and the scene
Oh
just
my
feels
God.
endless, and it's just so unfunny and poorly staged. And the film is just full of these awful comedic set pieces. And anytime they're in bed together, like they're trying to do this Blake Edwards slapstick thing, like he gets a back spasm, and he's like manic and all over the place, and like she's quipping one-liners at him, and they're both just so obnoxious.
Yeah.
I mean, none of the comedy in this works, and there are scenes in which they bicker, and it's supposed to be these like fiery sequences in which they're going at each other, but the dialogue they're saying just isn't sharp or interesting or funny at all. And she's just totally adrift at sea throughout the entire film because she has nothing to chew on. And she even has to deliver a rape joke at one point that's just like
Oh my God.
extremely off putting. Um,
Yeah.
and I think possibly the worst scene of them all, well, maybe not the worst because there's just so many equally bad scenes, is that there's a scene in which the two of them are watching Brief Encounter together, and
Oh
they're
my
they're
God.
sobbing, and all it does is remind you of how great Brief Encounter was and how just awful this cheap Blake Edwards screwball sex comedy imitation of it is. I mean, I feel like
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, I feel like they wanted this film to have kind of the impact that something like Bob and Ted and Carol and Alice had, but that film really was revolutionary and very well written and very well acted, and this just fails on all accounts.
Yeah. I was going to say, now that you mentioned that brief encounter scene, I do want to talk about a few earlier scenes, but
Oh yeah.
while we're on that topic, that fully comes out of nowhere. And the fact that they're sobbing, yes, first of all, what a reminder that I'd rather be watching Brief Encounter than this movie. Never a good thing when that happens. But also, we've never seen them express this kind of emotion at any point. So it just feels weird and out of place, and like these are not the same characters. And it's also about as subtle as a sledgehammer when they are like pondering like what's going to become of our relationship, and I'm just like, I
Yeah, and
genuinely don't care.
the scene cuts to them, and their faces are already covered in tears. So they basically just like dropped a bunch of water on their faces.
Yeah.
It's just
Pretty
it's
much.
so ridiculous.
I do think it is funny to give the film a little bit of credit when it just goes full on physical, like Min and Bill style.
Mm,
When they have this argument and she just straight up like chucks a suitcase at him.
yeah, yeah,
It's just like at a certain point these two completely despise each other, and I think Glenda's voice also really carries, so she certainly like makes a meal out of those argument scenes. Yes, that rape joke where she says my only chance to be raped and you can't get your bloody trousers off, yikes,
mm,
just really awful. And I don't even think that a character like that character, for as cynical and as sort of brash as she is, would ever even say something like that. So it takes me out.
yeah. For me, the only mildly funny performance in this for me is from Paul Sorvino, who plays a
Yes.
character who George Steele just keeps bumping into, and they have a sort of funny scene at the airport in which George Steele's trying to rent a car and basically trying to
Mm.
hide the affair at the same time. And Paul Sorvino just kind of keeps popping up throughout the film, and it's just kind of fun to see a young Paul Sorvino in this role. But for me, I don't think Glenda makes me laugh once, throughout the film. And toward the end, she does get the scene that I guess is supposed to be kind of her dramatic Oscar clip, in which Siegel has basically like abandoned her at this point, and he comes over and she's cooked dinner, and she thinks that she's become a nag, and she says that I'm beginning to sound like a wife, and this is I guess supposed to be the
Mm.
big, profound, moving scene, but it doesn't redeem anything that came before it, and the drama in this just feels so forced to me.
Yeah. I just fully don't even believe that they would want to continue an affair when they're back in London after that trip to Spain.
Mm-mm.
Like, fully unbelievable to me. I do think, yeah, she does handle some of that dramatic material towards the end pretty well when she's obviously falling for him on a deeper level than the kind of sneaking around fun secret mode that they'd been in. And yeah, starting to feel like that disappointed wife who's wondering where her man is, basically. And I think I would be more affected if I cared even a little bit about the two of them. But, the whole breakdown where she's kind of realizing that he's been out on the town with his wife and he's lied about his whereabouts, I think that is a nice showcase for her, especially when he grabs her and she's like, do not touch me. Do not. Those are the moments where I appreciate Glenda's performance a little more, is when the film decides to actually take something seriously. So the film ends decently enough for me, where I'm glad also that it ends the way that it does, where they're just like, we're never going to see each other again.
Yeah, yeah.
um and that rings true to me, at least. But yeah, it's just one of these things where I think she makes sense, and this is an interesting sort of risk for her in her career, because she doesn't want to be typecast as that serious, severe, dramatic British woman in the prestige films and the artful experimental films. She wants to do something more mainstream and broader, and she does tap into a little bit of that nice screwball energy, especially doing so more successfully than Siegel. But ultimately, yeah, I just as get to the end and I'm like, that was the performance in the film that warranted a second Oscar. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I guess she's not bad. the film is
Yeah.
bad. I don't think she's bad. I just don't think that she really lifts it in any, considerable way. But I mean, I
Right.
guess honestly, it's kind of a miracle, I guess, that George Segal wasn't nominated, considering how much they otherwise love
Mm.
this film and Jackson's performance. That is kind of a miracle to me. But yeah, all the love that was lavished on this is just so questionable. They really loved their middle-age adult sex comedies in this era.
Yes. And infidelity, and what
Yeah.
an interesting topic. Yes. I really don't have a whole lot else on Glenda, unfortunately, but I think we can explore a little bit when we talk about why she won. So let's transition into the Oscars discussion here. In terms of precursors, we had Marsha Mason winning the Golden Globe for drama over three of the competitors here. Glenda Jackson, the only one in comedy, of course, winning the Golden Globe there. And she was also runner up at New York Film Critics. Joanne Woodward actually won the New York Film Critics Award. Joanne Woodward is like queen of the New York Film Critics, naturally.
Yep.
But I think Barbra and Ellen just didn't really win anything, weren't too much of factors going into, the Oscars in terms of winning things. But let's talk about why we think Miss Glenda won her second Oscar, how she emerged from this pack of more dramatic performances. Is it just that it's the lone comedy? I mean, we've seen time and time again how that doesn't always play well. It didn't help Maggie Smith and Travels with My Aunt
Oh gosh.
necessarily to be the only comedy,
Well, Travels with My Aunt was
or
also
like a
not a Best Picture nominee.
that's true. That is true. But still, what do you think? What happened here? How did Glenda win? And how did the others lose? I
Yeah.
guess,
Well,
too.
so I do think being the one comedic turn of the five, it could be a factor, kind of in a Marissa Tomei sort of way,
Mm-hmm.
and how she was facing, for dramatic turns. I think that the Best Picture nomination indicated a lot of support within the Academy for the film. Very questionable support, but it was clearly there. And I mean, it should be said, the film was a critical and commercial hit at the time. It did very well. I remember, I mean, I talked to my mom about this, and she remembers Touch of Class, and she has actually pretty fond memories of the film. Definitely hasn't seen it since the '70s, but I think that it has a decent reputation among folks who were moviegoers in the '70s. One other factor, maybe a minor one, but still something to mention, is that it was distributed by AFCO Embassy Pictures, which were really strong Oscar players in this era. And in terms of Best Actress, they distributed Two Women with Sophia Loren. They did Long Day's Journey into Night with Kate Hepburn. They had The Graduate. They had The Lion in Winter. And they also had films like Carnal Knowledge and, a bunch of other things. They're basically forgotten now, but at the time they were pretty prominent and they did really well in terms of Oscar campaigning. So I think those are all factors, whether, they be big or small, for the most part small, but I think they have to be considered. And then, when you look at these other nominees, The Exorcist was a huge commercial hit, but it was clearly very polarizing among Academy members. And you look at, the lack of wins. Yes, it got screenplay and sound, but it also lost a ton of categories. And I think that there was a perception that Ellen Burstyn would almost certainly be back.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that with Cinderella Liberty, yes, Marsha Mason won the Globe, but it was also up for Best Picture over there and had a bunch of other nominations. And at the Oscars, it only had recognition for its music. So it's kind of questionable how much support there really was for that film with the Academy. I think on
Yeah.
Streisand's end, the lack of a Best Picture nomination for The Way We Were has to be considered. It also didn't get directing or screenwriting nominations. And I think that already at that time, and it might be unfair, but there was a perception that Streisand was kind of a pain in the ass to work with. And then with Woodward, Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams wasn't a commercial hit at all. And per usual, she just couldn't help herself in terms of publicly jabbing at the Academy. I think she said that it had become like a completely political award show or something like that. So I think that her comments probably didn't help. So I think all of that considered created a scenario in which Glenda Jackson could ultimately prevail, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually kind of similar to her first win in that respect, where it feels like all the other nominees had a little bit of either baggage or knocks against them in some way, and she kind of won by process of elimination almost,
Mm.
even though obviously people did really like her performance. And I think another part of it is that they valued that she was showing something different, proving that she can pull off a comedy in an American production. And yeah, in a very split race, I imagine. I think there was not a super obvious alternative, perhaps. Like I said, the support was sort of split between, Glenda and Marsha and Joanne, and Ellen Burstyn was in the biggest film of the year. Barbra Streisand is like the biggest star of the time. So I feel like there's a lot of different camps probably going into it, that maybe she only won by a small percentage of the vote. I also was reading part of, in Ellen Burstyn's memoir, she mentioned something to the effect that the more conservative members of the Academy were definitely turned off by The Exorcist and did not want to vote for it in pretty much any category. But so she said that, but she also said the film is a classic and has lasted longer and is shown more often today than any of the films we were in competition with at that time, which is probably true. Yeah.
Yeah.
But certainly in terms of legacy, her performance in that film has lasted the longest of any that we've talked about, or even in the Best Picture nominees too. But yeah, you can see the look of surprise on their faces. Not just Ellen, which is like an all-time great reaction. She's like, wow, just like fully gobsmacked that Glenda won.
Yeah.
And Joanne isn't really reacting very enthusiastically, and Marsha Mason seems a little lukewarm on it. So it's really wild to go back and look at the boxes there. Barbra apparently was hiding backstage, according to Inside Oscar.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the press at the time had painted it as a Burstyn versus Streisand race. I don't know how accurate that really was. But I mean, I feel like probably Woodward aside, the other four had some reason to think that they had a decent shot.
Yeah. If I was Marsha Mason winning that Golden Globe over a lot of my competition, I'd be like, maybe there's a chance,
Yeah, yeah.
But it happened the way it did. And Glenda won her second Oscar and, of course, was not there, much like in the vein of Katharine Hepburn, just was not interested in the whole Oscars pageantry of it all. But according to a statement, she was thrilled, even if what she has said is not always indicating that she was, in fact, thrilled. So make of that what you will. I'll be very intrigued to see who we pick for the runner-up when we get to that discussion, because I truly think, genuinely, it could have been any of them.
Yeah.
So, shall we get to some questions?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Let's start with Fritz.
Okay.
Which of her Oscars do you think Glenda cares less about?
I don't think she gives a shit about either of them, so I would say 0 for both.
Well, I will say that I found a quote actually where she literally said that she was more pleased with her Touch of Class win than her Women in Love win. So
hey, Glenda.
That's an interesting take. Probably because, like we were saying, she's doing something different and proving that she could do comedy and whatnot. That it's like, yeah. GCNDC said, is Glenda Jackson's win the last time there was a Best Actress winner for a comedy?
No way. I mean,
well, I will say at first when I saw this, I was like, no. But I will say that, like, we've had things even in recent years, like The Favorite and La La Land, Silver Linings Playbook. But then when I really thought about it in terms of like traditional comedy where there's like no real dramatic element, I couldn't see that. Because you could also say like Moonstruck or As Good as It Gets or Shakespeare in Love. But I feel like all those do have more of a dramatic quality to them too at times. This was just like a straight comedy. So I guess you could make the argument, but I don't know if you would make that
I don't know. I mean,
particular.
Is Annie Hall really a drama?
No.
Yeah. I don't know. I would argue.
I mean, she has those melancholier moments, but
yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know. I would argue there's been comic terms that have won since.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are like a couple dramatic parts to A Touch of Class that I don't think really work, but they are there.
This one from Zeta Short is related to A Touch of Class. Do you think that Steve Blackburn has sexual prowess? If not, what is it that makes him attractive to the opposite sex?
I mean, no, but I would say that this was an era in which, like Elliot Gould and Dudley Moore and yeah, George Segal were viewed as like sex symbols. So this was kind of what a lot of women were into, I guess.
Yeah, there you go. I have nothing to add there. Um, Kyle Crocodile, our friend Kyle Bailey. Would Glenda Jackson have slayed in Burstyn's role in The Exorcist?
Um, I mean, I think she would have done, quite well. But again, I mean, a number of actresses would have been amazing in that role, but Burstyn was perfect. So why, consider anybody else?
Yeah, I think Glenda would make more sense than some of the others that were in contention, but I'm happy with the way things worked out.
Yeah.
Christoph said, please discuss Ellen Burstyn's face journey when Glenda Jackson is announced as the winner. Is this the most genuine reaction we ever saw on the face of a losing nominee? And what would you give to see Barbara's reaction?
Oh God. I mean, for me, it's this and Samuel L. Jackson when he loses to Martin Landau that are like
Yeah.
the all-time great reactions, and I guess Sally Kirkland as well, of course. But I don't think Sally
Yeah.
Kirkland was like pissed about Cher winning. I think she was just so invested personally in the whole thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly share Burstyn's feelings at that moment, and I
Yes.
imagine Barbara was very confused. I don't know if Barbara was convinced that she was going to win, but if she wasn't to win, it would be somebody else.
Yeah. It is just really funny to watch just how openly unenthused they all are. Like, not just Ellen. But yeah, I don't think that Barbara would have been all that happy either.
Yeah, I mean,
She would not have.
I
Yeah,
think in those early days they weren't used to knowing that their face was going to be, on the screen in this kind of
that's
family
true.
portrait of reactions. So now they have to kind of rehearse and they're more knowing
Yeah.
of what the audience is seeing. Back then, they could just be themselves.
Although I will just say, in terms of the most recent Oscars in supporting actress, we had a pretty good reaction from Angela Bassett.
That's so true. But that reaction just breaks my heart more than it amuses me because
Yeah,
she
it's
looks
not funny, but
so
yeah,
devastated.
it's honest.
I know.
Yeah, I felt for her there. Um,
And Glenn, of course.
and Glenn, oh my God,
I
yeah,
like
trauma.
that's still triggering to me. Like, and that's popped up a bunch of times on Twitter because there's been some meme in which that's been retweeted, and I just
Yeah,
scroll past that as quickly as I can. It's just too
yeah,
cringe-inducing.
yes, I'm always inundated on a daily basis by that image. Ugh, anyway, I wish I could block an image
I know.
on Twitter.
I know.
Both John Anzalone and Joey Gentili want us to talk about if the horror bias came into play for Ellen Burstyn and why she lost.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, The Exorcist was so polarizing, and I think it was oddly enough more polarizing, even though it got so many nominations, than something like Rosemary's Baby, which only got a couple of nominations, but Ruth Gordon was able to win. I don't know. I think that the violence of it, the vulgarity of it, it was a very Exorcist specific thing that really rubbed people the wrong way. I think had it been more of a PG-13 horror movie, perhaps it wouldn't have offended so many people. But the religious aspects, the gore, the violence, the foul language, I think all of that combined altogether specifically really rubbed folks the wrong way in a way that Rosemary's Baby, which while a horrifying film, is not as violent or as vulgar a production.
Yeah.
I don't know. And they have such an odd relationship, the Oscars, with horror. I mean, Carrie was able to get some recognition down the line, but then other horror films have been shut out altogether. And then you look at something like Don't Look Now, which is also an
Mm,
amazing film, but got zero nominations in this year. So the horror bias with the Academy is very evident, but it really varies. They'll embrace something like Jaws, but then something else they'll give absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I also think it's a lot tougher in the lead categories, as Mia Farrow can attest to. Also, as Toni Collette or Lupita Nyong'o can say nowadays, I think there's just a hang up there where I I don't know if it's just like the plot elements and the scares are so centered in a lot of horror movies, even with these great performances, that maybe some viewers just don't see a lot of them as, traditional acting showcases,
Yeah, I mean,
which is a
I
shame.
think Kathy Bates is the exception. That
Yeah.
doesn't happen
Hmm.
often.
I wonder if Kathy Bates would even be nominated nowadays, honestly.
Yeah, I don't know. It's tough.
Yeah. So it's been a weird kind of yo yo almost.
Yep.
But anyway, Lila said Ellen Burstyn was probably hurt by horror bias, but at least she got a nomination. What are some of your favorite performances by actresses in horror movies that weren't even nominated? This is always something that we love to talk about on our little corner of film Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, obviously,
Snubbed horror queens. Yes.
obviously Mia Farrow and Rosemary's Baby. It's crazy she wasn't nominated, although that was a really stacked year. I would say Shelley Duvall in The Shining is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I love Claire Higgins in Hellraiser. Angie
Mm-hmm.
Dickinson in Dress to Kill. That's an amazing performance. And some of these aren't necessarily leads, but somebody like Carol Kane in When a Stranger Calls, that's a chilling performance. I mean, there's so many, just countless great horror actress performances.
And as previously mentioned, the Toni Collette, Lupita Nyong'o in recent years.
Yeah.
I would also not classify this as strictly horror, but for some reason, I also can think of like Naomi Watts in Mulholland
Hmm.
Drive in terms of an actress in a very dark movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, she rates pretty high for me. Mark Lamb said, "Imagine if Ellen Burstyn had somehow won this Oscar. Would that open the path to Jenna Rollins or to anyone else in 1974?"
Well, I mean, it's possible she could have repeated because they don't mind repeat winners in this category, as we saw with Louise Reiner and with Glenda Jackson. Um,
Right.
I think it's plausible she could have repeated, but odds are probably Jenna Rollins wins, although I'm not super confident because that film didn't get Best Picture or Best Screenplay. It only got the directing nomination. So I don't know if there was a ton of support for a woman under the influence. I don't think that Diane Carroll was going to win. I think that Valerie Perrine was going to struggle and lead.
Yeah.
And Chinatown's performance on Oscar night was just so middling, just with that screenplay win, that I imagine it would either be Burstyn repeating or Rollins.
Yeah. Well, we will probably explore more of this next week,
Yeah.
but I imagine the path for an alternate becomes easier. But yeah, at the same time, I think the Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore is such even a stronger showcase, obviously, than The Exorcist, ultimately, that she has a decent shot of repeating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kfley208 said, had Burstyn won here, would she have won next year as well for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore? We just talked about it. Dark Shaka said, during the early 70s, Burstyn complained about the lack of good roles for actresses. Do you agree with her?
Um, no. I mean, I know that I think it was 1975 that she was specifically talking about when she was
Yeah, right.
interviewed. And I mean, that's not like the greatest year ever, but it is actually kind of a fascinating Best Actress year because you have Anne Margaret nominated for Tommy, which is just such a bonkers performance. And then you have,
Yeah.
Carol Kane nominated for this tiny little movie called Hester Street, which just came out of nowhere, but it's a really great and inspired nomination. So, I mean, I think pretty much all these 70s years are to various extents, very interesting. I mean, 1970, for instance, I don't think is a particularly stacked year, but I could probably pile together a pretty strong Best Actress lineup, just looking at other contenders. So I don't know. I'm inclined to disagree with Ellen on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak from authority. I was not there in the early 70s. So, but like speaking in broad strokes, I can sort of, it makes sense that she would not be as enthused with the level of roles out there because maybe with like the production code going away, it definitely led to a lot of sex and violence. And I think in the process of that, it probably did affect the quality of roles for women, perhaps. So, I could sort of understand that. But yeah, I think there's all like every year has strong contenders and parts for women, even if they aren't on Oscar radar,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
yeah, for sure.
So, Sammy Flower said, in honor of The Exorcist, which of these 5 actresses would you like to possess for a day in their prime, and vice versa?
I mean, I feel like Joanne Woodward's the obvious answer, just because you could hang out with Paul Newman if you were
Yeah,
possessing her. But I guess you could
we'll
all,
do a lot more than hanging out.
but I guess you could also make a case for Marsha Mason if you want to hang out with Neil Simon. I mean, that could be
Hmm,
enjoyable, I guess. Yeah, but Joanne.
maybe. Yeah, it's a Joanne for me, and it's not even close. All right. Dark Shaka said, is Mason in the right category?
Yeah, I think
Which we
so.
discussed earlier.
I mean,
Yeah.
the movie is focused so much on Khan. It's from his perspective. It's not really from Mason's perspective. But I think she's ultimately in too much of it to really justify a supporting push.
Yeah, I think so. Joey Gentili said, do you think this was Marsha Mason's best shot to win, despite her absolutely should have won status in 1981 for Only When I Laugh?
I actually agree with Joey on that. I think that should have been her year. I think that she was reasonably close both here and in 77. I think she was very much in the running these two times, and I think she could have been runner up on both occasions. I think it's a close call between the two of them. I can't really say one or the other. Maybe for The Goodbye Girl, just because it was the Best Picture nominee and Dreyfus was winning, so maybe some folks voted for Dreyfus, also voted for Mason. I don't think she was really in contention for the other two at all. She was probably in fifth.
Yes, I will just add that this is a question that I will revisit on the 1981 episode.
Yes.
So when I'll have studied those other races more closely by that point. So yes, I'll take your word for it though. Both GCNDC and Seth Austin Stall want us to mention the Streisand loss maybe having to do with her big emotional scene on the phone where she is covering her face with her hand, which is a trick that is used when they can't get real emotions, quote unquote. So, did you pinpoint that as a particularly bad choice from Barbara to do that?
Not really. I know that Arthur Lawrence has said that, but Arthur Lawrence can be kind of a sour and bitter man. And I think he was perhaps not thrilled that he wasn't nominated for his screenwriting. I don't know if it was Streisand's choice or if it was Sidney Pollack's choice to do the face cover up thing. I mean, to be fair, a lot of people do cover up their faces when they're crying, so it's like
Yeah.
something that happens. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think it detracts from that scene because I think it still is a very devastating and moving scene, and I think it works wholeheartedly. Again, I think Lawrence is just kind of a pain, and he said bad things about other productions that he's been involved with as well. So this is just a common thing with him.
Yeah. I also really don't think that one scene not being up to its full potential was enough to make her lose an Oscar.
No.
So, yeah. Mark Lamb said, did Streisand's reputation as being difficult have anything to do with the idea that they didn't want to give her another Oscar? And also in parentheses, Yentl, Prince of Tides as well in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a factor, unfortunately. I mean, she did have a rep for being a pain. I mean, that's probably, unfair to some extent, but it's clear that the Academy really loved her early on and then had a problem with her as the years went on. I mean, she wins the Golden Globe for Yentl. That film, barely gets anything. They purposely seem to snub her for The Prince of Tides when it's nominated for 7 other Oscars. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely some friction there, and I think that's it's possible that was a factor here.
Yeah, she's always had that, not always, but definitely had that tenuous relationship with people in the industry and her reputation, even if there is a double standard there with her being a perfectionist and therefore being deemed difficult or needing to be like handled with care, that sort of thing. So yeah, just weird baggage that is unfortunate that it comes into play, but it does. Jamie said, this being the second and last of Barbara's acting noms, do you think she ever came close to a third? For which picture?
Well, she was probably, in the mix for A Star is Born. She does win the Golden Globe for that, and that was a
Mhm.
pretty big movie in '76. And then, I think that in '87 with the Nuts, she was right in there for that final slot that Streep ultimately got. And she was vying with, Faye Dunaway and Barfly and Lillian Gish for The Whales of August. So, I can fathom her being potentially sixth, both in '76 and in '87, in Best
Yeah.
Actress. I think it's definitely an argument there.
I wish I could also say Yentl, but
Yeah,
I'm not sure about the dynamics of that race.
no.
Matt Stillman said, if Streisand hadn't won for Funny Girl, was the Oscar hers here?
Um, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, that probably would have helped her a little bit, but again, I think the way we were wasn't super embraced here. I mean, yeah, the music won. It got some technical nods, but it wasn't in Best Picture, wasn't in Best Director, wasn't in screenwriting. So I mean, the support for it just really wasn't that robust, and it was fairly robust for A Touch of Class. So I do
Yeah.
think it would have helped her had she not already won, but wouldn't have necessarily been a deciding factor.
It would be an interesting butterfly effect if Gregory Peck does not invite Barbra Streisand into the Academy prematurely and she votes for herself and causes a tie. Then Katharine Hepburn just wins again and is not in a tie. And then does Barbara go on to win? I don't know. Or does she make different career choices so that she could later win? I don't know. That's wild to think about.
Or it's possible that she just has the songwriting Oscar and no acting Oscar.
Right, right. That's true. Omar Tubio said, "Isn't The Way We Were Barbara's best performance?"
I
No,
think it's
not for me, but
I think a case could be made. I think it's probably her best dramatic performance. But I think Funny Girl
mm,
is just so iconic and it's such a great vehicle
yeah,
for her that it's hard to argue, against Funny Girl. I think I actually
right.
might like The Way We Were more as a film than Funny Girl, though, because I think Funny Girl in its second half is a really mixed bag.
Yeah,
And I think people
goes
forget,
off a
yeah,
cliff.
people forget that. I think The Way We Were is actually a
Hmm.
little bit more satisfying as a film.
Yeah, even if I think Barbara's performance in the former is certainly bigger and louder and better.
Yeah.
Fritz said, "What are your summer wishes and winter dreams?"
Well, I usually wish for nice mild summers, nothing over
Hmm.
90 degrees. And my winter dreams, I guess, would be just like, lots of hot cocoa, hot cider, warm
Hmm.
beverages,
Yeah.
sweaters.
Yes. My summer wish is to be beach body ready, of course,
Yes,
as
yes,
always. And my winter dream is to not be hit with seasonal depression.
yes.
So
Same.
that's my dream. I believe the original title of that was Death of a Snow Queen, which would have been, I feel like, false advertising
I know.
in a way. I feel like people would go into that expecting something else, but
Yeah. I like that too, though.
I kind of like that
Yeah.
more. Yeah. Ronaldo Sosa said, "Do you think Joanne's nomination this year for Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams was at least partly for her missing the year before for her towering performance in the effect of gamma rays on Men in the Moon marigolds?"
Maybe a tiny bit, but I don't think it was really a deciding factor. I don't think that there was like an outrage that she wasn't nominated for that.
Right.
So maybe a teensy weensy bit, but no, I think she got in because she was really like the critical favorite for this.
I think she had momentum maybe
Hmm.
from that previous
Yeah.
year, but yeah. Let's get to some miscellaneous questions here. Of course, we always get some casting questions. From Fritz, recast the 5 parts with the 5 actresses. Oh boy.
Um. Okay.
So I'll say mine, and you can say if you agree or not. This is the combination I came up with. So here's where I landed. I landed on Joanne Woodward in The Exorcist.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have, much as I don't want anyone to be saddled with a touch of class, I put it in Barbra Streisand.
I could see that, and I know that I forget which one they did. Streisand and Siegel did a movie together, and I can't recall which one it was. And they had actually pretty decent chemistry in it, so that
Yeah.
actually could work.
Mm-hmm. I have Ellen Burstyn in Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Uh, then things just got kind of weird, and I was just like, what am I left to slot in with here? I have Marsha Mason in The Way We Were.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. And then somehow I landed on Glenda Jackson in Cinderella Liberty, even though that makes no sense, but there it is. I don't know who else I would put in Cinderella Liberty.
Yeah. I mean, I could see Ellen Burstyn doing a touch of class as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe Streisand and Cinderella Liberty could be interesting.
Hmm. Yeah.
That
That
could
would
be
be
fun.
a wild one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any other alternates there?
No, I mean, I could see Glenda Jackson easily doing Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams too, and being, quite
Hmm.
wonderful. I think that Woodward makes a lot of sense for The Exorcist.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got some Tatum O'Neal questions here, of course. Jeffrey Kerr said, had Tatum O'Neal been nominated as lead instead of supporting for Paper Moon, who in this Best Actress lineup do you think she would have replaced?
That's tough, but I suspect probably Woodward, just because she had a tendency to sometimes miss. The film really wasn't a huge hit, and I can actually fathom Sylvia Sidney just kind of being a lone nominee for this little film.
Hmm.
I think it's hard to fathom any of the others dropping.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say if there was a different one, that it might be Barbara,
Hmm.
even though she is obviously who she is and the film was a big hit. I could also see a scenario where they just decide to ignore her again.
Yeah,
I don't know why. I think the Ellen Burstyn and Marsha Mason, those performances seem a little bit baitier to me,
yeah,
personally.
maybe. I could also, however, see Tatum just snubbed in Best
Hmm.
Actress because they don't want to nominate a child
Yeah.
lead.
Oh yes, I would agree. And let's tease up the next question from both Dark Shaka and Joe Gouveia, both of them wondering if Tatum O'Neal is in the correct category. Does she have a shot? I don't know if that's a shot to win or a shot at a nomination. Do we think she could win if she's in here?
Maybe I would be more confident if Paper Moon was in Best Picture, but
Yeah.
it's that touch of class Best Picture nomination that just it
Mm-hmm.
just it makes it tough to come up with an alternate to Glenda. I feel like if a touch of class was that well liked, then it was going to be Glenda's.
Yeah, I would agree. Unfortunately.
Yeah,
Um, Aaron said, who do you think would win Best Supporting Actress if Tatum O'Neal had been nominated for Best Actress?
that's tough. I think that I think that the Mercedes McCambridge controversy was really devastating to Linda Blair's bid, and I don't think that it would have
Mm-hmm.
been her, especially since The Exorcist was just so polarizing and lost in so many categories. Um,
Agreed.
I think that Candy Clark campaigns very heavily, and I think that that was how she got the nomination. But whether that could translate to a win, I think is very questionable. She doesn't really do a
Happy
ton.
to be there.
Yeah, I don't think she really
Yeah.
does a ton in that movie. I like her, but it's really not a really showy role. So it's for me, it's between Alan Kahn or Sylvia Sidney, who could maybe win as kind of like a career win. I would say probably Kahn in the end, but I could fathom Sidney maybe having a shot too.
Yeah, I actually think it might be Sydney here, who I think won like a critics award, maybe
Hmm.
like National Board of Review. I think she won also.
Yeah,
But yeah, I think it could be a random like one-off, almost if Joanne isn't in there, like a lone supporting actress win from a movie that's not nominated anywhere else.
yeah. I
Um,
do think one
but she
thing
does
that
make such a big impression.
yeah, the one thing that may hurt her a little bit is that she's out of the film like 20 minutes into it. Um,
This is true.
but she's so good in it. It's such a great
Hmm.
performance.
Eric Maxwell Brunn said, what about Julie Christie in Don't Look Now? Should two horror performances have been nominated? As a horror lover, I say yes.
Yeah, Julie Christie's awesome in that, and I think both would probably make my best actress cut. Um, it should be said that I think Don't Look Now really wasn't a huge hit at the time. I think the reevaluation of it as a classic didn't happen until later. So I don't think it was a surprise that she didn't make the cut at the time,
Yeah. And it obviously didn't get any other nominations.
right?
But yes, I think I would nominate her. I do think Donald Sutherland has the better role for me, but I'd absolutely take Julie Christie over, honestly, a few of these nominees,
Mm,
not just Glenda.
yeah.
So, Kflee208 said, did Burstyn slash The Exorcist take the steam out of another horror performance in Julie Christie being nominated in Don't Look Now? I'm not sure if one had much to do with the other, honestly, but
Yeah,
yeah,
it really wasn't a huge thing at the time. And I think that
right.
there was an issue with, I think Paramount had a ton of movies this year. I know they had, um, they were the distributor for Don't Look Now, and I know that they had Paper Moon and Serpico and Save the Tiger, and I think a couple others. So they just had a ton on their plate, and I don't think Don't Look Now was really very present, in terms of what their huge pushes were.
Christopher Perkins said 1973 saw the release of a Pam Grier classic, Coffee. Cast her in one of these 5 Oscar-nominated roles.
I mean, I think that Cinderella Liberty is the obvious answer, but I think that's kind of like a lazy answer. I feel like it'd actually be something like A Touch of Class would be more fascinating just to watch her like beat up on George Segal a
Yes, exactly.
bit. I'd rather see that, but I mean, I could fathom her in Cinderella Liberty too.
Yeah, I could kind of see her in a lot of these at different ages of her career.
Mm,
But yes, I think I might land on A Touch of Class,
yeah.
even if I don't like the material. Kyle Crocodile said, why do you think Liv Ullmann was left off with how much they loved Cries and Whispers this year?
I bet she was sixth. If I had to guess who was sixth, it was probably Lee Volman. I don't know if there was any category confusion with her and Harriet Anderson, who I think was formally pushed supporting, but I mean, overall, I suspect Lee was probably in sixth, considering, she was a presence in Best Actress, in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, I think another question would be why they left her out for The New Land
Mm,
when she won multiple critics awards for it,
mm,
actually. Maybe that's part of it too. There wasn't a consensus on which of those for her to go for.
mm. Yeah.
And the fact that she was just nominated for the same character the previous year
Hmm.
in The Emigrants.
Yeah, odds are she was probably in sixth. And I could see
Mm-hmm.
her being, reasonably close.
Dark Shaka said, thoughts on Sissy Spacek in Badlands? Well, first of all, Badlands was eligible in 1974, so that's when she would be in Oscar contention there. But I think she's great. I love Badlands. I think her and Martin Sheen are so great together. And yeah, can't wait to start talking about Sissy in a few weeks.
Yeah, she's awesome. It's been a while since I've seen that though. But yeah, excellent performance.
Final question from Joey Gentili. Recast these 70s Oscar talents in the roles above: Karen Black, Bette Midler, Ally McGraw, Tuesday Weld, Candy Clark.
Well, I think Karen Black in The Exorcist makes the most sense because she had a
Bingo.
long history of horror, and I think would actually be
Mm-hmm.
pretty good in that. I think Bette Midler and Cinderella Liberty could be interesting.
Mm.
And I guess Ally McGraw is like the obvious for The Way We Were, just because it kind of mirrors Love Story in some ways.
Ay, ay, ay.
But the other two, I don't think Tuesday Weld or Candy Clark are a particularly good fit for either of the other two. Maybe Tuesday Weld in A Touch of Class, but then Candy Clark
No.
would make no sense in Some Wishes, Winter Dreams. I mean, they're both just
Well, I guess an older version of Candy Clark in Summer Wishes and Winter Dreams.
yeah. I mean,
How about
I
that?
guess if you just like make her up, but
Yeah.
yeah, neither of them are particularly ideal for either of those remaining two.
Well, I thought of maybe Bette Midler in The Way We Were
Yeah, yeah,
could work.
but
And then I guess like Ally McGraw in Cinderella Liberty. I don't know.
maybe yeah.
Don't love that either. But yeah, your combination is pretty much what I thought of there.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Well, we're done with questions, so now it's time for our final segment where we give our verdict on who we think was the runner-up to Glenda Jackson. Andrew, what's your verdict? I'm dying to know.
Yeah, I wish I could say I was confident about this, but I'm really not. I don't think it was Joanne Woodward because I think that, again, the film wasn't a huge hit, and she made a lot of comments that I think, again, rubbed people the wrong way, just as she did 5 years earlier with Rachel Rachel. I think had Cinderella Liberty received more nominations, I could make a case for Marsha Mason, but as it stands, it only gets the music recognition. So I'm not convinced that there was a ton of Cinderella Liberty support, and I think there was also perception that Mason could potentially win in the near future. So I'm not going to say Mason. So that leaves Streisand or Burstyn, and that's really tough. I think The Exorcist would win other Oscars before Burstyn would take it. I think it would have won either other technical awards or perhaps even Jason Miller maybe would have won before. I don't see The Exorcist just winning, let's say, actress, sound, and screenplay. At the same time, the support isn't that strong for The Way We Were, so there's factors against Streisand. I'm going to say just because The Exorcist was so polarizing, and since The Way We Were did get, a few other nominations beyond music, my guess, and it's not a confident guess, I'm going to guess that Streisand was the runner-up with Burstyn and Mason reasonably close behind her, and then Woodward the clear fifth.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, this is a really, really, really tough call, more so than most that I've talked about. For me, right now, I think with hindsight, I think a lot of casual people could just say, oh, it was obviously Ellen Burstyn because of it's The Exorcist, and it's like, the number one movie of the year, and I got 10 nominations. But like you said, it's such a polarizing film, and I think it's also a film where you might not leave the film thinking of Ellen Burstyn compared to all the other shit that's going on there. So I kind of want to take her out, unfortunately. I do think Joanne Woodward is, for me, not a clear fifth, but I think the low visibility probably really affected her there, even though it's a very strong traditional dramatic turn that they would typically go for. For some reason, I just can't picture Barbra getting to that runner-up position, much as I understand what you're saying. So I kind of land on Marsha Mason somehow, having won the Golden Globe, of course. Not that that is an obvious, like, one-to-one always, but winning over three of her competitors there, and also just being, I think, a very Oscar-friendly kind of role, especially with Jane Fonda having won 2 years prior for Clute. And I think it's just she is a kind of actress, and that's a kind of film that feels like it would fit in with a lot of actress wins in the 70s for me, even if she isn't the full lead. So I'm very tentatively going with Marsha Mason, knowing full well that I could be wrong
So
and that it could be any of
yeah,
them.
it's totally possible. I mean, I think a solid case could be made for Streisand, Burstyn, or Mason.
Mm-hmm.
If we ever see the vote tallies, we'll see how
Yes.
close. But I can fathom them being so bunched up together. Yeah, I would
Yes.
totally, I could totally go with Mason if there were a few other nominations for the film.
Yeah.
But as it stands, I lean ever so slightly toward Barbara.
That's fair. That's fair. We've done a lot of agreeing on this episode anyway,
Yeah,
so we can disagree on that. Um,
I think we may also disagree on the winner potentially. Our personal
we'll
winners,
see.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, there it is. You set it up right there. Who would get your vote from
This
this
is
lineup?
also really challenging. So for me, it's almost like a four-way tie with Glenda to the side. Ultimately, the way I have to approach this is that I give Marsha Mason the win in 1981 for Only When I Laugh. I give Joanne Woodward the win for Rachel, and I give Ellen Burstyn the win for Requiem for a Dream. I never otherwise give Barbra Streisand a win, not even for A
Hmm.
Star Is Born in music. Because of that, Barbra Streisand is my winner. Because I want her to have an
Wow.
Oscar.
So, in your alternate history of Oscars, this just makes the most logical sense to reward her there.
Yes, I've spread the
I
love.
love
And
it.
for Glenda, I give her the win for Sunday Bloody Sunday. So, yeah, make
Hmm.
everybody happy.
Yeah, so everyone wins.
Yes.
Truly. Well, I respect that choice. I personally would be one of the cool kids voting for Ellen Burstyn
Yes.
in
Yes.
The Exorcist, who I think is, like I said in the beginning, I think very much in service of the film, and she never feels like she's out of place or even overshadowing the film that she's in. And I think it's a role that is very juicy and meaty, but it's not written in a way that's like, this is obviously going to get an Oscar nomination for this actress, like it kind of feels like it is for Summer Wishes, Winter Dreams, Cinderella Liberty, even The Way We Were to a certain extent. I appreciate when an actress is, serving the story and also giving a great performance on top of that, and is, just part of like the equilibrium of it. And for my own personal Oscar history, this makes the most sense for me to reward her here.
Yeah.
So
yeah, she is my runner-up, with
mm-hmm.
Woodward third, Mason fourth, and then obviously Glenda.
That's fair. All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. The time really flew by, as it always does when we have our discussions.
That was awesome.
But yes, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's always a pleasure. Again, this is my favorite podcast, so always happy to be on.
Oh. Well, you're one of my favorite guests. You're the one who kicked off the Best Actress series, so I couldn't not have you on again.
I know. It's a real treat always.
Yes, thank you. So tell people where they could find more of you on the internet if they haven't already.
Yeah, so my blog is theawardsconnection.com. I am a writer over at Awards Watch, and hopefully someday I'll be on IMDb as a screenwriter.
Yes. We're all pulling for you there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for listening. You could find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. The show's at Oscar Runner Up. Instagram at And the Runner Up is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, patreon.com/And the Runner Up is, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes. And next week, we'll be covering the 1974 Best Actress lineup, where the nominees were Ellen Burstyn in Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Diane Carroll in Claudine, Faye Dunaway in Chinatown, Valerie Perrine in Lenny, and Jenna Rollins in A Woman Under the Influence, with the winner being Ellen Burstyn. So with that, thanks again, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Kevin.
And I will bid you all adieu.